In the mist-shrouded forests of the Argonne, on a crisp October morning in 1918, a single American soldier would perform one of the most extraordinary feats of courage in military history. Armed with nothing but his rifle and unwavering resolve, this quiet mountain man from Tennessee would capture or kill an entire German battalion, forever changing the course of the Great War's final offensive. His name was Alvin York, and though he never wanted to fight, he would become the most decorated soldier of the First World War. But to understand the magnitude of Sergeant York's actions on that fateful day, we must first journey back to the rocky hills of Tennessee, where a poor farm boy would grow into a marksman whose skills were matched only by his faith, and whose reluctance to fight would make his eventual heroism all the more remarkable. Chapter 1. The Mountains of Tennessee, December 13th, 1887. The bitter wind howled through the Cumberland Mountains of Tennessee as Mary Elizabeth York brought her third child into the world. In a cramped two-room log cabin in the remote community of Pall Mall, near the Kentucky border, Alvin York drew his first breath. The cabin was little more than a shelter against the harsh Appalachian winter, its rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a single chimney sending smoke into the grey sky above. The York family epitomized the hardscrabble existence of the mountain folk. William Uriah York, Alvin's father, worked from dawn to dusk as both a subsistence farmer and a blacksmith, his calloused hands testament to a life of constant labor. Mary Elizabeth, his wife, was a woman of quiet strength and deep religious conviction, her weathered face bearing the marks of countless worries about feeding her growing family. She would eventually bear 11 children, each one adding to the burden of survival in these unforgiving mountains. Pall Mall was not a town in any conventional sense. There were no paved roads, no streetlights, no shops or schools worthy of the name. It was simply a collection of scattered homesteads, where families like the Yorks eked out an existence from the rocky soil and dense forests. The nearest real town, Jamestown, lay miles away over treacherous mountain paths that became impassable in winter. Here, in this isolated pocket of Appalachia, time seemed to move at a different pace, governed by the seasons and the eternal struggle for survival. From his earliest memories, young Alvin understood that life meant work. There was no childhood, as city folk might understand it, no time for games or leisure when every member of the family was needed to ensure the next meal. By the age of 6, he was already contributing to the family's survival, helping tend the small plot of corn and vegetables that supplemented their diet of wild game. His hands, still small and soft, learned the feel of rich earth and the careful nurturing required to coax sustenance from the thin mountain soil. The York children received what passed for education in those remote hills. 9 months of schooling, if the weather permitted, and if the children could be spared from their chores. The one-room schoolhouse, heated by a single pot-bellied stove, served students of all ages. Alvin learned his letters and numbers, enough to read the Bible that his mother treasured above all possessions. But formal education was a luxury the York family could ill afford. By the time he might have completed what others would call elementary school, Alvin was already considered a man, with a man's responsibilities weighing on his young shoulders. When William York died in November 1911, the family's precarious existence became even more challenging. Alvin, at 24, was the oldest son still living at home. His 2 elder brothers, Henry and Joseph, had married and moved away, seeking their fortunes in distant valleys. The responsibility for supporting his mother and younger siblings fell squarely on Alvin's broad shoulders, a burden he accepted without complaint, as mountain men had done for generations before him. To supplement the meager income from their small farm, Alvin took work wherever he could find it. He labored on railroad construction crews, his powerful frame and tireless work ethic earning him respect among the hardened men who laid track through the mountains. He worked as a logger, his keen eye and steady hand making him valuable in the dangerous business of felling massive trees on steep mountainsides. The sound of his axe would ring through the forest from dawn to dusk, each swing precise and powerful, a testament to the strength that mountain life had built into his frame. But it was with a rifle that Alvin truly excelled. In the York household, hunting was not a sport, but a necessity. The difference between a successful hunt and returning empty-handed could mean the difference between a family feast and hungry children. William York had been known as one of the finest marksmen in the mountains, and he had passed his skills to his son with the same care that other fathers might teach a trade. By the time Alvin was a teenager, his reputation as a marksman had spread throughout the region. The mountain men of Tennessee measured shooting skill by practical standards. Could you put meat on the table? Could you kill a wild turkey with a single shot to the head, preserving the valuable meat while proving your marksmanship? Could you win the turkey shoots that were both entertainment and serious competition in these remote communities? Alvin could do all of this and more. His shooting was not just accurate, but seemingly effortless, a natural extension of his will. He would hold his breath, sight down the barrel of his rifle, and squeeze the trigger with the same calm precision with which he might thread a needle. At local turkey shoots, where the best marksmen competed for prizes and bragging rights, Alvin's name became legendary. These events, held at crossroads and gathering places throughout the mountains, drew men from miles around. Each competitor would pay a small fee for the chance to shoot at a turkey tethered behind a log, with only the bird's head visible as a target. The distances were challenging, often exceeding 100 yards, and the targets were small. Many skilled hunters would miss entirely, but not Alvin York. Time and again, his shots would find their mark with deadly precision, earning him not only the turkey, but the admiration of men who had spent their lives perfecting their marksmanship. But success in these competitions brought more than just meat for the table. Word of Alvin's shooting prowess spread beyond his immediate community, and with it came opportunities that would begin to change his life. Wealthy sportsmen from the cities would occasionally venture into the mountains, seeking guides who could ensure successful hunting expeditions. Alvin's reputation earned him employment with these men, and for the first time in his life, he glimpsed a world beyond the narrow confines of Pall Mall. These early experiences with outsiders showed Alvin that there was a larger world beyond the mountains, but they also reinforced his sense of loyalty to his home and family. No matter how far his work might take him, he always returned to the small cabin where his mother waited, to the younger siblings who depended on him, to the familiar rhythms of mountain life that had shaped every aspect of his character. Yet even as Alvin matured into a man whose skills and reliability were respected throughout the region, there was another side to his character that caused his family considerable worry. Like many young men in these isolated communities, Alvin found release from the grinding demands of survival in periodic bouts of drinking and revelry. When he had money in his pocket from his various jobs, he would sometimes disappear for days at a time, joining other young men in the illegal saloons that operated in the shadows of mountain society. These establishments, hidden in remote hollows and accessible only to those who knew the secret paths, served moonshine whiskey that could strip paint from a fence post. Here, mountain men would gather to drink, gamble, and settle scores that had been building for weeks or months. The code of the mountains demanded that any slight to a man's honor be answered, and the combination of strong liquor and proud temperaments often led to violence. Alvin, despite his generally peaceful nature, was not immune to the atmosphere of these places. His imposing physical presence, he stood well over 6 feet tall and possessed the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of hard physical labor, made him a formidable opponent in any confrontation. When challenged, his mountain pride would not allow him to back down, and more than once, he found himself in fierce fights that left both participants bloodied and exhausted. His mother, Mary Elizabeth, watched these changes in her son with growing alarm. A devout member of the Church of Christ in Christian Union, she had raised her children to believe in the power of faith and the importance of living according to Christian principles. To see her eldest son, the family's main provider and her greatest hope, descending into the violent, drunken world of the mountain saloons, was a source of constant heartache. The church that Mary Elizabeth attended was not like the established denominations found in more settled areas. The Church of Christ in Christian Union was a small, fundamentalist sect that had emerged in the aftermath of the Civil War, drawing its membership primarily from the poor and working classes of Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Its teachings were strictly pacifist, based on a literal interpretation of Christ's commandment to turn the other cheek. Members were forbidden from engaging in violence of any kind, and they viewed war as fundamentally incompatible with Christian faith. For Mary Elizabeth, watching her son's transformation from the gentle boy she had raised into a man who settled disputes with his fists was more than just a mother's natural worry. It was a spiritual crisis that threatened everything she believed about the power of faith to guide and protect her family. She prayed for Alvin daily, asking God to show him a different path, to touch his heart, as she believed only divine intervention could. Her prayers seemed to go unanswered as Alvin's reputation as a fighter grew alongside his fame as a marksman. He became known throughout the region as a man who could outshoot anyone and who would never back down from a challenge. This reputation brought a certain respect in mountain society, where personal courage and the ability to defend oneself were highly valued. But it also made Alvin a target for other young men seeking to prove themselves. The situation reached a crisis point in 1914, when one of Alvin's closest friends, Everett Delk, was beaten to death in a saloon brawl. The news of Everett's violent end struck Alvin like a physical blow. Here was a young man much like himself, raised in the same mountains, facing the same struggles, who had met his end in the same kind of pointless violence that Alvin himself had been engaging in for years. Standing at Everett's grave, surrounded by the grieving family and friends who had watched a promising young life snuffed out in a moment of drunken fury, Alvin began to question the path he had been following. The realization that he could just as easily have been the one in that rough pine coffin forced him to confront truths about himself that he had been avoiding. His mother's tears, falling silently as they lowered her son's friend into the Rocky Mountain soil, spoke more powerfully than any sermon about the consequences of the life he had been living. But it would take more than the shock of Everett's death to truly change Alvin's direction. That transformation would come through an encounter with faith that would reshape not only his personal life, but ultimately determine the course of history itself. Chapter 2. The Lightning Strike. As 1814 drew to a close, the isolated communities of the Cumberland Mountains were visited by a phenomenon that occurred with some regularity in these deeply religious settlements: a revival meeting. These gatherings, led by traveling preachers who carried the gospel from town to town, were among the few events that could draw mountain families from miles around. For people whose lives were marked by endless work and few pleasures, a revival offered both spiritual sustenance and social connection. The revival that came to Pall Mall in December 1814 was led by Reverend H. Russell, a minister with the Church of Christ in Christian Union. Russell was a man in his 40s, thin and intense, with the kind of piercing gaze that seemed to look directly into a person's soul. He had spent years carrying his message through the remote regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, preaching to congregations of poor farmers, laborers, and mountain folk who found in his words both comfort and challenge. For Mary Elizabeth York, the arrival of Reverend Russell represented an answer to years of prayer. She had watched her son drift further from the Christian values she had tried to instill in him, and she saw in this revival a possible turning point. She urged Alvin to attend, not with demands or ultimatums, but with the quiet persistence of a mother who refused to give up hope. Alvin's initial motivation for attending the revival meetings had little to do with spiritual conviction. Among the families gathering each evening in the small church was Grace Loretta Williams, a young woman whose beauty and gentle manner had caught his attention. Gracie, as she was known to her friends, was 17 years old, with dark hair and eyes that reflected both intelligence and kindness. More importantly, she was from a respectable family that would never permit their daughter to associate with a man of Alvin's reputation. So it was that Alvin found himself sitting in the rough wooden pews of the church, ostensibly listening to Reverend Russell's sermons, but actually stealing glances at the young woman whose presence had drawn him there. Night after night, he attended the meetings, gradually becoming aware that the preacher's words were beginning to penetrate the defensive walls he had built around his heart. Reverend Russell preached with the fervor of a man who had seen the transformative power of faith in the hardest circumstances. His sermons were not the polished theological discussions that might be heard in city churches, but rather direct, emotional appeals that spoke to the specific struggles of his audience. He talked about the cycle of violence and poverty that trapped so many mountain families, about the way alcohol and fighting could destroy not just individuals, but entire communities. But more than just pointing out problems, Russell offered hope. He spoke of redemption, of the possibility that any person, no matter how far they had fallen, could find forgiveness and a new beginning through faith in Christ. His message resonated particularly strongly with young men like Alvin, who had grown up in an environment where violence was often seen as the only solution to personal conflicts. As the revival meetings continued through the final weeks of 1814, Alvin found himself increasingly moved by what he heard. The combination of his friend Everett's recent death, his mother's evident distress over his behavior, and his growing feelings for Gracie Williams created a perfect storm of motivation for change. But it was Reverend Russell's New Year's Day sermon that would provide the catalyst for transformation. January 1st, 1815, dawned cold and clear in the Cumberland Mountains. Snow lay thick on the ground, and the breath of the small congregation gathered in the church formed visible clouds in the unheated building. Reverend Russell stood before them, his voice echoing off the rough log walls as he delivered what would prove to be one of the most important sermons in Alvin York's life. The exact content of that sermon has been lost to history, but its effect on Alvin was immediate and profound. Years later, he would describe the experience by saying, "It was as if lightning struck my soul." In that moment, sitting in the simple mountain church surrounded by neighbors who had known him all his life, Alvin York underwent the kind of complete spiritual transformation that believers call being born again. The change was not gradual or partial. From that day forward, Alvin completely abandoned the behaviors that had marked his early adulthood. He stopped drinking entirely, never again touching the moonshine that had led to so many of his troubles. He ceased fighting, even when challenged by other men who sought to test whether his reputation was deserved. Most remarkably for those who knew him, he stopped swearing, cleaning up language that had been as rough as the mountains where he lived. The transformation was so complete and so immediate that it amazed everyone who knew him. In mountain communities where change came slowly and skepticism ran deep, Alvin's conversion was viewed with wonder and not a little suspicion. Could a man really change so completely overnight? Was this genuine transformation, or simply another phase that would pass when the excitement of the revival wore off? Time would prove the authenticity of Alvin's conversion. Months passed, then years, and the changes in his character remained constant. He began attending church regularly, not as someone seeking to impress Gracie Williams, but as a man genuinely committed to living according to Christian principles. His involvement in the Church of Christ in Christian Union deepened, and he took on responsibilities within the congregation that reflected his growing spiritual maturity. He became a song leader, his rich baritone voice carrying the hymns that were such an important part of mountain worship. In a community where few people could read well enough to follow hymn books, the song leader played a crucial role in worship, lining out the verses so that the congregation could follow along. Alvin's natural leadership abilities, previously channeled into less constructive pursuits, now found expression in guiding his neighbors in praise and worship. He also became a Sunday school teacher, working with young people in the community to help them understand the Bible and its teachings. This role required not only knowledge of Scripture, but also the ability to communicate complex spiritual concepts to minds shaped by the practical realities of mountain life. Alvin threw himself into this work with the same dedication he had once brought to hunting and fighting, studying his Bible with the intensity of a scholar. Most significantly, he was elected as a deacon in the church, a position that carried considerable responsibility in the small congregation. Deacons were expected to be examples of Christian living, to counsel other members who faced difficulties, and to help guide the church's decision-making process. For a man who, just a few years earlier, had been known primarily for his ability to drink and fight, this elevation to church leadership represented a remarkable transformation. His mother, Mary Elizabeth, watched these changes with joy and relief that bordered on the miraculous. The son who had caused her so many sleepless nights of worry had become the kind of man she had always prayed he would be. More than that, he had become a leader in the church that meant everything to her, a living testimony to the power of faith to transform even the most unlikely candidates. The relationship with Gracie Williams that had initially drawn Alvin to the revival meetings deepened as his character changed. The Williams family, observing the genuine nature of his transformation, gradually accepted him as a suitable suitor for their daughter. Gracie herself was impressed not just by the dramatic change in Alvin's behavior, but by the depth of commitment he showed to his new faith. In June 1917, they became engaged, planning a marriage that would unite two of the most respected families in the Church of Christ in Christian union. But even as Alvin's personal life was settling into patterns of contentment and respectability, forces far beyond the peaceful mountains of Tennessee were stirring that would test his faith in ways he could never have imagined. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the nations of Europe had been locked in a devastating war since 1914. What had begun as a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had rapidly expanded to engulf most of the European continent, with millions of men dying in trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. For 3 years, America had remained officially neutral in what President Woodrow Wilson called a European war. But by 1917, a combination of factors, German submarine warfare, the infamous Zimmermann telegram, and growing economic ties to the Allied powers, had made American entry into the conflict virtually inevitable. On April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany, and the United States began mobilizing for what would become known as the Great War. The declaration of war sent shockwaves through American society, but nowhere were its implications more troubling than in the small pacifist communities scattered throughout rural America. For members of churches, like the Church of Christ in Christian Union, which had built their entire religious identity around the principle of nonviolence, the prospect of being called to military service represented a fundamental challenge to everything they believed. On June 5, 1917, all American men between the ages of 21 and 31 were required by law to register for military service. Alvin York, at 29 years old, fell squarely within the age range for the draft. As he walked to the registration site in Jamestown, the county seat, he carried with him not just the simple documentation required for the process, but the weight of a moral dilemma that would test the very foundations of his faith. The registration form was straightforward enough, asking for basic information about name, age, occupation, and family circumstances. But one question stopped Alvin cold. Do you claim exemption from draft? Specify grounds. After a long moment of reflection, he picked up his pen and wrote 5 simple words that would change the course of his life. Yes. Don't want to fight. Those words represented more than just personal preference. They were the expression of deeply held religious convictions that had been shaped by years of Bible study and spiritual reflection. The Church of Christ in Christian Union interpreted Jesus' commandment to turn the other cheek as an absolute prohibition against violence. Members of the church were taught that Christians could never, under any circumstances, take up arms against their fellow human beings, regardless of the political or military justifications offered. For Alvin, this was not a theoretical position, but a practical reality that shaped every aspect of his daily life. Since his conversion, he had refused to fight, even when directly challenged, walking away from confrontations that the old Alvin would have eagerly engaged. The idea of not just fighting, but killing other human beings was so contrary to everything he now believed that it seemed unthinkable. Yet even as he claimed exemption from military service, Alvin was acutely aware of another set of obligations that tugged at his conscience. He was an American, born and raised in these mountains that had been shaped by generations of men who had answered their country's call to service. His own family had a tradition of military service stretching back to the Revolutionary War. The thought of being seen as a coward or as someone who would not do his duty when his country needed him was deeply troubling to a man raised with the mountain code of honor. The registration completed, Alvin returned to Pall Mall to await the decision of the draft board. He had done what his conscience demanded, claiming exemption based on his religious beliefs. Now it remained to be seen whether the government would respect those beliefs or whether he would be forced to choose between his faith and his patriotism. The wait would not be long, and the answer would set in motion a chain of events that would lead from the peaceful mountains of Tennessee to the blood-soaked forests of France, where a reluctant warrior would perform deeds that would make him one of the most celebrated soldiers in American history. Chapter 3. The Test of Faith. The draft board's response to Alvin York's claim for conscientious objector status came with bureaucratic swiftness and devastating finality. In a brief, formal letter delivered to the York family's cabin in late summer 1917, the Fentress County Draft Board informed Alvin that his exemption had been denied. The reason given was simple but crushing. The Church of Christ in Christian Union was not recognized by either the state of Tennessee or the federal government as an official religious denomination. This decision reflected the unfortunate reality facing many members of small, rural religious sects in 1917. The Selective Service Act did provide for conscientious objector status, but only for members of well-recognized religious sects or organizations whose principles forbade participation in war. The Church of Christ in Christian Union, with its limited membership scattered across just 3 states, did not meet the government's criteria for recognition. For Alvin, the denial represented more than just a bureaucratic disappointment. It was a direct challenge to the religious convictions that had become the foundation of his new life. The government was essentially telling him that his beliefs, no matter how sincerely held, were not worthy of official recognition. He was faced with a choice that seemed impossible: abandon his religious principles or face legal consequences that could include imprisonment. Despite the draft board's decision, Alvin did not give up hope of avoiding military service. He filed an appeal, hoping that higher authorities might take a more favorable view of his case. While that appeal was being considered, he continued his life in Pall Mall, working to support his family and maintaining his active role in the church. But the knowledge that he might soon be forced to choose between his faith and his freedom cast a shadow over everything he did. The appeal process was lengthy and uncertain, and as the weeks passed with no resolution, Alvin began to prepare himself for the possibility that he would have to enter military service. He spent long hours in prayer and Bible study, seeking guidance from Scripture about how a Christian should respond when faced with demands that seemed to contradict divine law. He consulted with other church members, including his pastor, seeking wisdom from those who shared his beliefs. But despite these spiritual resources, Alvin found no easy answers. The Bible seemed to contain passages that could support different positions on the question of war and peace. Jesus had indeed commanded his followers to turn the other cheek, but he had also told them to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. The Old Testament contained numerous accounts of divinely sanctioned warfare, while the New Testament emphasized love for one's enemies. As autumn turned to winter, the uncertainty finally ended. Alvin's appeal was denied, and in November 1917, he received orders to report for military service at Camp Gordon, Georgia. The night before his departure, he knelt in the small cabin that had been his home for all 30 years of his life, praying for guidance and strength to face whatever lay ahead. His mother, Mary Elizabeth, sat nearby, her own prayers mixing with his as she struggled with the knowledge that her son was about to be taken from the peaceful world she had worked so hard to create for him. The journey from Pall Mall to Camp Gordon was the farthest Alvin had ever traveled from home. As the train carried him through the rolling hills of Tennessee and into the red clay country of Georgia, he watched the landscape change with a mixture of fascination and homesickness. Never before had he been separated from the mountains that had shaped his entire existence, and never before had he faced such uncertainty about his future. Camp Gordon, established just months earlier as part of America's rapid military expansion, was a world unto itself. Thousands of young men from across the South had been gathered here to be transformed from civilians into soldiers. The camp sprawled across hundreds of acres, its hastily constructed barracks and training facilities a testament to the urgency of America's war effort. For Alvin, accustomed to the quiet rhythms of mountain life, the noise and chaos of the military camp was overwhelming. Drill sergeants shouted orders in language that would have made his old drinking companions blush. Men from dozens of different backgrounds and regions were thrown together in barracks that offered no privacy and little comfort. The daily routine was rigidly structured, with every moment from reveille to taps planned and supervised by military authorities. But perhaps most challenging for Alvin was the discovery that he was not alone in his religious convictions. Camp Gordon housed dozens of other conscientious objectors, men from various religious backgrounds who had been denied exemptions but still refused to participate in military training. These men faced constant harassment from other soldiers who viewed their pacifist stance as cowardice, and they were often assigned to menial labor duties that kept them separated from regular military training. Alvin could have easily joined this group, accepting assignment to non-combat duties that would have allowed him to serve his country without directly violating his religious beliefs. The other conscientious objectors welcomed him, recognizing in his sincere faith a kindred spirit who understood the difficult position in which they all found themselves. For a brief time, it seemed that this might be the solution to his dilemma. But even as he gravitated toward the other objectors, Alvin found himself troubled by aspects of their situation that seemed inconsistent with his understanding of duty and service. Some of the men seemed to be using religious conviction as a convenient excuse to avoid the dangers and hardships of military life. Others appeared to take a certain pride in their refusal to cooperate with military authorities, turning their pacifism into a form of rebellion rather than genuine spiritual conviction. More troubling still was Alvin's growing awareness of his own conflicted feelings about the war itself. While his religious training had taught him that all war was wrong, his practical mountain sense told him that sometimes people had to fight to protect what they held dear. He had grown up with stories of his ancestors who had fought in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, men who had taken up arms to defend principles they believed in. The idea that he might be abandoning that tradition troubled him more than he cared to admit. These internal conflicts came to a head when Alvin was assigned to Company G of the 328th Infantry Regiment, part of the 82nd Division. His company commander was Captain Edward Courtney Bullock Danforth Jr., a young officer from Augusta, Georgia, who was both a professional soldier and a devout Christian. Captain Danforth had been watching Alvin's struggle with interest, recognizing in the tall mountaineer both exceptional potential as a soldier and genuine spiritual sincerity. Rather than simply ordering Alvin to comply with military training, Captain Danforth took a different approach. He began having informal conversations with the troubled young man, discussing not just military duties, but the deeper questions of faith and service that were tormenting Alvin's conscience. These conversations often lasted long into the night, with the two men sitting in the captain's quarters, their Bibles open before them as they wrestled with questions that had challenged Christian thinkers for centuries. Captain Danforth was joined in these discussions by Major George Edward Buxton, the battalion commander. Major Buxton was an unusual figure in the military hierarchy of 1917, a professional soldier who was also a serious student of theology and scripture. He had graduated from Brown University and had spent years studying the relationship between Christian faith and military service. For him, the question of whether a Christian could serve as a soldier was not theoretical, but deeply personal. The three men would gather in Major Buxton's quarters, their conversations illuminated by the glow of a single electric bulb hanging from the ceiling. The discussions were not debates in any formal sense, but rather earnest explorations of scripture and conscience by three men seeking to understand God's will in the midst of human conflict. Major Buxton would quote passages from the Old Testament showing God commanding the Israelites to fight for their homeland and their faith. He would point to Jesus' words about rendering unto Caesar what belonged to Caesar, arguing that Christians had obligations to their earthly governments as well as to their heavenly Father. He spoke of the concept of just war, the idea that sometimes military force was necessary to protect the innocent and defend righteous causes. Alvin would respond with passages from the Sermon on the Mount, with Jesus' commands to love one's enemies and turn the other cheek. He would speak of the early Christians who had refused to serve in Roman armies, accepting martyrdom rather than taking up arms. He would cite the teachings of his church, the sincere convictions of men and women who had found in pacifism the truest expression of Christian love. Night after night, these conversations continued, with each man growing in respect for the others, even as they maintained their different positions. Captain Danforth and Major Buxton came to understand that Alvin's pacifism was not cowardice or lack of patriotism, but rather the sincere expression of a man who took his faith seriously. Alvin, for his part, began to see that his officers were not simply trying to manipulate him into compliance, but were themselves struggling with the difficult questions of faith and duty. And the turning point came during one particularly intense discussion, when Major Buxton read from the 33rd chapter of Ezekiel, "But if the watchman sees the sword coming, and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes, and takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hand." As the Major's voice echoed in the small room, Alvin felt something shift inside him. The passage seemed to speak directly to his situation, suggesting that there were times when good men had not just the right, but the obligation to stand against evil, even if it meant taking up arms. The idea that his pacifism might actually be a form of selfishness, a refusal to accept the responsibility of protecting others, struck him with the force of revelation. After hours of discussion, Alvin stood up, his tall frame filling the small room. "All right," he said quietly. "I'm satisfied." With those simple words, he committed himself not just to military service, but to the idea that his faith and his duty to his country could be reconciled. But even as he made this commitment, Alvin asked for one final favor from his commanders. He requested a 10-day leave to return home to Tennessee, where he could pray and reflect on the decision he had made. He needed to be certain that this was truly God's will, and not simply the result of skillful persuasion by his officers. Major Buxton, recognizing the sincerity of Alvin's request, granted the leave. It was an unusual decision. Soldiers were rarely given extended leave during basic training, but both officers understood that the resolution of Alvin's spiritual crisis was more important than adherence to standard procedures. So it was that in early spring 1918, Alvin York found himself once again traveling the familiar mountain paths of his home, carrying with him questions that would determine not just his own future, but the fate of hundreds of men who would serve under his leadership in the trials to come. Chapter 4: The Mountain and the Decision. The train that carried Alvin York back to Tennessee in March 1918 moved through a landscape awakening from winter's grip. Spring was coming early to the Cumberland Mountains, and as he traveled the final miles to Pall Mall, Alvin could see the first tender green shoots of new growth pushing through the dark soil of his homeland. It seemed fitting that this journey of spiritual decision should coincide with the season of renewal and rebirth. But the beauty of the awakening mountains could not ease the turmoil in Alvin's mind. The conversations with Major Buxton and Captain Danforth had opened possibilities he had never considered, challenging beliefs he had thought were settled forever. For the first time since his conversion, he found himself questioning not his faith itself, but how that faith should be expressed in a world where evil seemed to require more than prayers and good intentions to defeat it. His homecoming was marked by the quiet joy typical of mountain families. Mary Elizabeth York embraced her son with the fierce love of a mother who had worried every day since his departure, while his younger siblings gathered around to hear stories of the world beyond their mountains. But even in the warmth of family reunion, Alvin carried himself with the weight of a man facing the most important decision of his life. The members of his church welcomed him back with genuine affection, but also with concern. Word had reached them that Alvin was struggling with his commitment to pacifism, and many feared that the military environment had begun to corrupt the faith that had transformed him so completely just 3 years earlier. His pastor and fellow deacons watched him carefully, ready to provide spiritual guidance if he seemed to be wavering in his convictions. But Alvin said little about his experiences at Camp Gordon or the discussions that had brought him home. Instead, he threw himself into the familiar routines of mountain life, working alongside his brothers to prepare the family's small farm for spring planting, hunting in the forest that had been his childhood playground, and attending church services with the same devotion he had shown since his conversion. Yet those who knew him best could see that something fundamental had changed. Where once his faith had seemed absolutely certain, now there was a quality of searching in his prayers, a hesitation in his responses to questions about Scripture that suggested deep internal struggle. Mary Elizabeth, with the intuitive understanding that comes from a lifetime of loving care, recognized that her son was wrestling with questions that went to the very heart of who he was and who he was meant to become. The crisis came to a head on a warm spring evening as Alvin sat on the porch of the family cabin, watching the sun set behind the familiar ridges of his childhood. The 10 days of his leave were almost over, and he would soon have to return to Camp Gordon with either a firm commitment to his pacifist beliefs or an acceptance of his duty as a soldier. The weight of this decision pressed on him like a physical burden, making it difficult to eat or sleep or find peace in any of the activities that had once brought him comfort. As darkness fell and his family settled into their evening routines, Alvin made a decision that would become one of the defining moments of his life. He rose from the porch, picked up his Bible, and began walking toward a formation known locally as the Yellow Door, a distinctive rock outcropping high on the mountainside that offered both solitude and a commanding view of the valley below. The climb to the Yellow Door was steep and rocky, requiring careful navigation even in daylight. By moonlight, it was treacherous, but Alvin had walked these paths since childhood and needed no light to guide his feet along the familiar trail. As he climbed higher, the sounds of human habitation faded away, replaced by the night music of the mountains, the calling of owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. The Yellow Door itself was a natural shelf of limestone that jutted out from the mountainside, creating a level platform perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. From this vantage point, one could see for miles across the valley, taking in the scattered lights of distant cabins and the silver ribbon of the Wolf River winding through the darkness below. It was a place that had always spoken to Alvin of the majesty and power of God's creation, and it seemed the perfect setting for the spiritual wrestling match that lay ahead. Settling himself on the familiar rock, Alvin opened his Bible and began to read by the light of the moon. But this was not casual study or routine devotion. This was the desperate seeking of a man who needed divine guidance for a decision that would affect not just his own life, but potentially the lives of countless others. He read through the passages that had supported his pacifist convictions: the Sermon on the Mount, the commands to love one's enemies, the early Christian refusal to take up arms. But he also read the passages that Major Buxton had quoted, the stories of divinely sanctioned warfare in the Old Testament, Jesus' words about rendering unto Caesar, the responsibilities of the watchman to warn his people of approaching danger. As he read, he prayed with an intensity that seemed to draw its power from the very rocks beneath him, asking God to show him clearly what was expected of a faithful Christian in a world at war. Hours passed in this spiritual struggle. The moon traced its arc across the star-filled sky, while Alvin wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Was his pacifism a genuine expression of Christian love, or was it a form of selfishness that allowed him to remain pure, while others fought and died to protect what he held dear? Could a man truly love his neighbors while refusing to defend them against those who would do them harm? Was there a difference between personal non-violence and the obligations of a citizen when his country called for service? As dawn began to break over the mountains, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Alvin felt a clarity descend upon him that seemed to come from outside himself. The words of Major Buxton echoed in his mind. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hand. In that moment of dawn clarity, Alvin understood that his calling was not to absolute pacifism, but to the protection of the innocent and the defense of righteous causes. He could love his enemies while still opposing their evil actions. He could maintain his faith while taking up arms in defense of freedom and justice. The seeming contradiction that had tormented him for months resolved itself into a higher understanding of Christian duty. Rising from his night-long vigil, Alvin York was no longer the conflicted young man who had climbed the mountain in darkness. He was a soldier of faith, ready to serve both his God and his country with the same wholehearted devotion he had brought to every important commitment in his life. The decision had been made, and it had been made in communion with the divine presence that had first touched his soul in that small mountain church 3 years earlier. The journey back down the mountain was swift and purposeful. Alvin had work to do, preparations to make, goodbyes to say, a commitment to fulfill. His family, seeing the change in his demeanor, understood without being told that the crisis had passed and that their Alvin had found his way forward. Mary Elizabeth, though grieved by the knowledge that her son would soon be going to war, recognized in his newfound peace the same divine guidance that had first brought him to faith. The remaining days of his leave passed quickly. Alvin spent time with each member of his family, creating memories that would sustain him through the trials ahead. He met with Gracie Williams, explaining to his fiancée the decision he had made and asking for her patience as he fulfilled the duty that had been placed before him. She, with the wisdom and strength that would make her a perfect partner for a man of his character, assured him of her support and promised to wait for his return. On his final Sunday at home, Alvin stood before the congregation of the Church of Christ in Christian Union and explained his decision. It was not a sermon or a formal presentation, but rather the simple testimony of a man who had found peace with God's will for his life. He spoke of his love for his church and his continued commitment to Christian principles, but also of his understanding that sometimes those principles required action rather than passive resistance. The congregation received his words with the same grace they had shown throughout his spiritual journey. While some might have preferred that he maintain his pacifist stance, all recognized the sincerity of his seeking and the authenticity of his decision. They pledged to pray for his safety and for the wisdom to serve faithfully in whatever circumstances lay ahead. When the time came to return to Camp Gordon, Alvin York left Pall Mall with the blessing of his family, his church, and his own conscience. The train that carried him back to Georgia bore a different man than the one who had left just 10 days earlier. Where there had been conflict, there was now resolution. Where there had been doubt, there was now certainty. Where there had been a reluctant conscript, there was now a committed soldier ready to face whatever challenges the war might bring. Captain Danforth and Major Buxton, seeing the change in their returning soldier, knew immediately that the spiritual crisis had been resolved. The tall mountaineer, who reported for duty, carried himself with a new confidence, a sense of purpose that transformed him from a potential problem into one of the most promising recruits in the company. His marksmanship, already legendary among his fellow soldiers, was now matched by a commitment to excellence in all aspects of military service. The transformation was remarkable to observe. Alvin threw himself into military training with the same intensity he had once brought to hunting, and later to his religious studies. He mastered the manual of arms, learned military protocols, and developed the leadership skills that would soon make him invaluable to his unit. His natural abilities, enhanced by his renewed sense of purpose, marked him as a soldier destined for greater things. But even as he excelled in training, Alvin maintained the essential character traits that had defined him since his conversion. He refused to drink, smoke, or engage in the gambling and carousing that were common among soldiers. He attended religious services whenever possible and maintained a regular schedule of personal prayer and Bible study. His fellow soldiers, initially skeptical of what they saw as religious pretension, gradually came to respect both his abilities and his character. The spring of 1918 passed quickly in intensive training. The 82nd Division, originally intended to be composed entirely of men from the southeastern states, had been designated as one of the first units to be sent to France. The urgency of training reflected the desperate situation on the Western Front, where German forces were launching their final major offensive of the war in a last-ditch attempt to achieve victory before American forces could tip the balance. As summer approached, the pace of training intensified. Live fire exercises replaced theoretical instruction, and the reality of what lay ahead became increasingly clear to every soldier in the division. They would soon be facing an enemy that had been hardened by 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history, fighting in conditions that would test every aspect of their training and character. For Alvin, this prospect held no terror. He had wrestled with his conscience and emerged with a clear understanding of his duty. He had trained with dedication and mastered skills that would serve him well in combat. Most importantly, he had found a way to reconcile his faith with his service, creating a foundation of spiritual strength that would sustain him through trials that would have broken lesser men. The orders came in May 1918. The 82nd Division would embark for France within the month. As Alvin packed his meager possessions and prepared for the journey that would take him farther from home than he had ever imagined possible, he carried with him not just the physical tools of warfare, but the spiritual certainty that he was fulfilling God's purpose for his life. The boy from the Cumberland Mountains was about to become a key figure in the greatest conflict the world had yet known. Chapter 5. Across the Atlantic. The USS President Grant wallowed through the grey swells of the North Atlantic, her holds packed with over 8,000 American soldiers bound for the battlefields of France. Among them, wedged into a hammock in the ship's bowels, where the air was thick with the smell of seasickness and unwashed bodies, lay Alvin York, experiencing his first voyage beyond the sight of land. For a man whose entire life had been spent within the stable confines of the Tennessee mountains, the constant motion of the ship was disorienting beyond imagination. The deck heaved and rolled beneath his feet with every wave, making simple tasks like walking or eating exercises in balance and determination. The horizon, when he could glimpse it through a porthole, seemed to shift and dance in ways that defied every natural law he understood. The journey across the Atlantic in May 1918 was fraught with dangers that extended far beyond seasickness. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, hunting for the convoys that carried American soldiers and supplies to the war zone. Every man aboard the President Grant knew that at any moment, a torpedo might tear through the ship's hull, sending them to the bottom of the ocean before they ever had a chance to face the enemy they had trained to fight. But for Alvin, the physical discomfort and constant danger were less challenging than the human drama unfolding around him in the ship's crowded quarters. The 82nd Division drew its men from across the American South, creating a mixture of backgrounds and temperaments that would have been impossible in the more homogeneous communities of his mountain homeland. There were city boys from Atlanta and Birmingham who had never seen a farm, much less lived on one. There were immigrants from Italy and Greece whose families had fled poverty in Europe only to see their sons returning to fight on the continent they had left behind. There were men who spoke with the cultured accents of Charleston society, and others whose rough mountain dialect marked them as kindred spirits to Alvin's own background. In the cramped quarters of the troopship, these differences created friction and occasional conflict. Men who might never have met under normal circumstances were forced to live in closer proximity than most families, sharing not just space, but uncertainty about what lay ahead. Arguments broke out over trivial matters, fueled by boredom, fear, and the natural tensions that arise when thousands of young men are confined together for weeks at a time. Alvin found himself serving as an unofficial mediator in many of these disputes. His imposing physical presence commanded respect, while his newfound spiritual maturity gave him a perspective that helped him see beyond the surface disagreements to the fears and concerns that really drove the conflicts. He had learned in his own life how anger and violence could mask deeper needs, and he used that understanding to help his fellow soldiers find common ground. One particularly memorable incident occurred when a fight broke out between two men in his company over an imagined slight during a card game. The argument quickly escalated, with other soldiers choosing sides based more on regional loyalties than any understanding of the actual dispute. As voices rose and men began pushing and shoving in the narrow confines of their quarters, it seemed inevitable that the confrontation would explode into the kind of brutal shipboard brawl that could result in serious injuries. Instead, Alvin stepped into the center of the conflict, his calm voice cutting through the angry shouting. Without taking sides or trying to determine who was right or wrong, he simply began talking about home, about the families waiting for their return, about the country they were all going to serve, about the need for men to stand together rather than tear each other apart before they ever face the real enemy. His words, delivered without preaching or condescension, had a remarkable effect. The immediate anger began to dissipate as men remembered why they were on this ship and what they were sailing toward. The two original combatants, shamefaced by the realization of how petty their dispute had been, shook hands and returned to their bunks. The larger group, momentarily united by Alvin's reminder of their common purpose, settled back into the routine of shipboard life. This incident, and others like it, established Alvin's reputation aboard the President Grant as a natural leader and peacemaker. Men began coming to him with their problems, seeking advice or simply someone who would listen to their fears and concerns. His fellow soldiers, many of whom had initially been skeptical of his mountain background and religious convictions, gradually came to see him as a stabilizing influence in their unit. The respect he earned during the Atlantic crossing would prove invaluable in the trials ahead. Military effectiveness depends not just on individual skill, but on the bonds of trust and mutual support that exist between soldiers. The weeks aboard the President Grant gave Alvin the opportunity to build those relationships, creating a foundation of leadership that would serve him well when he faced the ultimate test of combat. The ship's daily routine provided little relief from the monotony and discomfort of the crossing. Revels sounded before dawn, followed by calisthenics on the crowded deck space, breakfast consisting of whatever provisions the ship's galley could produce, and then hours of waiting with little to occupy mind or body. Some men gambled, others wrote letters home, still others simply stared at the endless expanse of grey water that surrounded them on all sides. Alvin spent much of his time reading his Bible, and writing in the diary he had begun keeping when he first registered for the draft. The entries from these weeks at sea reveal a man coming to terms with the magnitude of the commitment he had made. Far from the familiar mountains of home, surrounded by men from backgrounds completely different from his own, he was discovering new aspects of himself and his faith. The diversity of his fellow soldiers challenged some of the assumptions he had grown up with about people from different backgrounds. The Italian immigrants, whom mountain folk might have viewed with suspicion, proved to be devoted family men who worked as hard as anyone to master their military training. The city boys, initially dismissed as soft, showed courage and determination that earned his respect. These discoveries broadened his understanding of American society and strengthened his conviction that the cause they were all serving was worth the sacrifices it demanded. As the President Grant approached the coast of France in late May 1918, the mood aboard ship became increasingly serious. The men knew that their time of preparation was nearly over and that they would soon face the reality of combat, for which no amount of training could fully prepare them. Letters home took on a different tone, with many soldiers writing what might be their final messages to families they might never see again. Alvin's own letters to his mother and to Gracie Williams reflected his characteristic blend of simple honesty and deep faith. He wrote about his confidence in God's protection and his commitment to doing his duty, but also about his homesickness and his longing to return to the peaceful mountains where life moved to the rhythm of seasons rather than the demands of war. The first sight of the French coast came at dawn on a clear morning in late May. After weeks of seeing nothing but ocean, the appearance of land on the horizon created excitement throughout the ship. Men crowded onto the deck, straining for their first glimpse of the continent, where they would either prove themselves as soldiers or die in the attempt. The port of Le Havre, where the President Grant docked, presented the Americans with their first view of a nation that had been at war for nearly 4 years. The harbour was crowded with ships of every description: military vessels, cargo carriers, hospital ships bearing the wounded back to safety. The city beyond the docks showed the scars of a country that had sacrificed everything in its struggle for survival. For Alvin, stepping onto French soil was a moment of profound significance. He was farther from home than any member of his family had ever travelled, in a country whose language he did not speak, preparing to face dangers that he could barely imagine. Yet he felt no regret about the journey that had brought him to this point. The decision made on a mountaintop in Tennessee had led him inexorably to this moment, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead with the same faith that had guided him through every important transition in his life. The process of disembarking thousands of soldiers and their equipment took most of the day. As the men of the 82nd Division finally formed up on French soil, they presented an impressive sight: thousands of young Americans ready to add their strength to the Allied cause. They had crossed the ocean safely, overcome the challenges of shipboard life, and emerged as a cohesive military unit. Now they would face the ultimate test of their training and character in the trenches and battlefields of the Western Front. For Alvin York, the arrival in France marked the end of one chapter of his remarkable journey and the beginning of another. The mountain boy who had struggled with his conscience about military service had become a soldier prepared to serve his country with distinction. The reluctant recruit had emerged as a natural leader whose character and abilities would soon be tested in the crucible of combat. As the 82nd Division marched away from the docks of Le Havre toward the training areas where they would prepare for their first taste of battle, Alvin carried with him all the experiences that had shaped his character: the poverty and hardship of his mountain childhood, the wild years of drinking and fighting, the transformative power of religious conversion, the struggle to reconcile faith with duty, and the bonds of friendship forged during the Atlantic crossing. All of these elements would come together in the weeks ahead as he faced challenges that would test every aspect of his training and character. The shy mountain boy was about to become one of the most celebrated soldiers in American history, but that transformation would come at a cost that none of them could yet imagine. Chapter 6. Into the Line. The forests of northeastern France, in the summer of 1918, bore little resemblance to the woodlands of Alvin York's Tennessee mountains. Where the Cumberland Hills had been places of peace and natural beauty, these French woods had been transformed by 4 years of warfare into landscapes of desolation and death. Shell holes pocked the earth between splintered tree stumps, while the constant threat of sniper fire made every movement a calculated risk. After several weeks of additional training at camps behind the lines, the 82nd Division was deemed ready for its first taste of combat. The men of Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, including Corporal Alvin York, he had been promoted during training in France, found themselves assigned to a sector near the village of Saint-Mihiel, where they would participate in what would become the first major American offensive operation of the war. The Saint-Mihiel salient was a bulge in the German lines that had existed since 1914, when advancing German forces had captured this strategically important area before the front lines stabilized into the trench warfare that characterized the Western Front. For 4 years, the salient had been a thorn in the side of Allied operations, providing the Germans with observation posts and artillery positions that threatened key transportation routes. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, had long advocated for an American-led operation to eliminate this threat. By September 1918, he finally had sufficient forces to attempt such an operation, with over 500,000 American soldiers ready to prove themselves in their first major battle as an independent fighting force. For the men of the 82nd Division, the approach to the Saint-Mihiel sector was a journey into hell. The roads leading to the front were clogged with military traffic, trucks carrying supplies, ambulances evacuating the wounded, artillery pieces being moved into position for the coming attack. The sound of gunfire, which had been a distant rumble during their training, grew steadily louder as they moved forward. The landscape itself told the story of the war's devastation. What had once been prosperous farming communities were now empty ruins, their buildings reduced to piles of rubble by years of artillery bombardment. The few civilians who remained lived in cellars and makeshift shelters, emerging only when necessary to scavenge for food or water among the ruins of their former lives. Alvin found himself profoundly moved by the suffering he witnessed. His own family had known poverty and hardship, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the complete devastation that war had brought to these French communities. Children begged for food from passing soldiers, their hollow eyes reflecting a knowledge of violence and loss that no child should possess. Elderly men and women searched through the rubble of their former homes, looking for any salvageable remnant of lives that had been shattered by forces beyond their control. These sights strengthened rather than weakened Alvin's resolve. The abstract concepts of freedom and democracy that had been discussed in training camps took on concrete meaning when he saw their absence in the faces of people who had lived under German occupation. The decision he had made on a Tennessee mountaintop was validated by every destroyed village and every refugee family they encountered. The men of Company G took their positions in the trenches facing the Saint-Mihiel salient on September 11, 1918. For most of them, including Alvin, this was their first experience of life on the front lines, and the reality was more horrifying than anything their training had suggested. The trenches themselves were marvels of military engineering and monuments to human misery, dug deep into the earth and reinforced with wood and sandbags. They provided protection from enemy fire while serving as home, workplace, and sometimes grave for the men who manned them. The bottom of the trenches was usually covered with wooden duckboards to keep soldiers' feet out of the mud and standing water that accumulated from rain and poor drainage. But no amount of engineering could address the fundamental horror of trench life. The air was thick with the stench of death, human waste, and the chlorine used to disinfect latrines. Rats, grown fat on human corpses, scurried through the trenches with a boldness that shocked men accustomed to viewing such creatures as minor nuisances. The constant threat of sniper fire meant that any movement above the trench line during daylight hours was likely to draw a bullet from German marksmen who had been perfecting their deadly skills for years. Sleep was nearly impossible, not just because of the physical discomfort, but because of the constant noise. Artillery shells shrieked overhead at all hours, some landing close enough to shower the trenches with dirt and debris. Machine guns chattered in the distance, punctuated by the sharp crack of rifles and the occasional explosion of grenades. Even during the quietest moments, there was always the sound of men coughing, the scrape of equipment being moved, the whispered conversations of soldiers trying to maintain their sanity in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy it. For Alvin, who had grown up in the profound silence of the mountain wilderness, the constant noise was perhaps the most difficult aspect of trench life to endure. He had learned to read the forest by its sounds, the warning call of a bird that indicated the presence of a predator, the rustle of leaves that might signal the movement of game. Here, the cacophony of warfare made such subtle observations impossible, leaving him feeling deaf and disoriented. But gradually, as the days passed, he began to develop new senses adapted to this artificial environment. He learned to distinguish between the sounds of incoming and outgoing artillery, to recognize the different types of weapons by their distinctive reports, to identify from the sound alone whether approaching aircraft were friendly or hostile. These skills, developed through necessity and refined by his natural talents as a hunter, would serve him well in the trials ahead. The Saint-Mihiel offensive began before dawn on September 12, 1918, with the largest artillery barrage in American military history up to that time. For 4 hours, nearly 3,000 American and French guns pounded German positions with a fury that could be heard for miles. The earth shook with the impact of hundreds of thousands of shells, and the sky lit up with an artificial dawn created by muzzle flashes and explosions. When the barrage lifted at precisely 0500 hours, over 200,000 American soldiers climbed out of their trenches and advanced across no man's land toward the German positions. The 82nd Division, including Alvin York's company, was in the second wave of the attack, following close behind the assault troops who would bear the brunt of the initial German resistance. The experience of going over the top for the first time was one that would remain etched in Alvin's memory for the rest of his life. The whistle blast that signaled the beginning of the attack seemed to release all the tension that had been building during the long hours of waiting. Men who had been crouched in the trenches like compressed springs suddenly exploded into motion, climbing the wooden ladders that led up and out of their protective earthworks. The landscape that greeted them was unlike anything from the natural world. No man's land, the strip of contested ground between the opposing trenches, had been transformed by years of warfare into an alien moonscape. Shell holes filled with stagnant water dotted the torn earth, while coils of barbed wire created obstacles that had to be cut or climbed. The bodies of men who had fallen in previous attacks lay scattered across the ground, some fresh enough to still resemble human beings, others reduced to scattered bones and scraps of cloth. But despite the horrors of the terrain, the Saint-Mihiel offensive proved to be a remarkable success. The German forces, weakened by years of attrition and demoralized by the intensity of the American artillery barrage, offered less resistance than expected. Many German soldiers, particularly the younger men who had been drafted to replace the casualties of earlier battles, surrendered rather than fight to the death for positions they knew were untenable. For Alvin and his company, the advance was a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The fear of death was constant and overwhelming, but it was balanced by the excitement of forward movement after months of static training and preparation. They were finally doing what they had crossed an ocean to do, driving the German army back toward its own borders and proving that American soldiers could fight as effectively as any in the world. The fighting, when it occurred, was brief but intense. German machine gun nests that had survived the artillery barrage opened fire on the advancing Americans, forcing them to take cover and work their way forward by bounds and rushes. snipers picked off unwary soldiers who exposed themselves too long in the open. Artillery shells, called down by German observers, exploded among the advancing troops with deadly effect. But the Americans pressed forward with a determination that surprised both their enemies and themselves. These men, many of whom had never been in a fight more serious than a barroom brawl, displayed the kind of courage under fire that marked them as natural soldiers. They worked together with an instinctive understanding of small unit tactics, covering each other's movements and coordinating their attacks with a skill that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than their formal training. Alvin's performance during the San Miguel offensive was exemplary, but not yet extraordinary. He followed orders, supported his fellow soldiers, and showed the kind of steady courage that marked him as reliable in combat. His marksmanship skills, honed in the Tennessee mountains, served him well when opportunities arose to engage German soldiers at long range. But he had not yet faced the kind of situation that would reveal the full extent of his capabilities. The offensive achieved its objectives within 48 hours, eliminating the San Miguel salient and capturing over 15,000 German prisoners, along with hundreds of artillery pieces and vast quantities of supplies. For the American Expeditionary Forces, it was a triumph that proved they could fight as an independent army rather than simply reinforcing French and British operations. For Alvin personally, the battle was a confirmation that his decision to embrace military service had been correct. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, had seen friends wounded and killed without losing his own effectiveness, and had contributed to a victory that brought the war perceptibly closer to its end. The mountain boy who had once been paralyzed by moral doubts about warfare had become a soldier whose performance under fire marked him for greater responsibilities. The promotion to corporal that came after San Miguel was both recognition of his battlefield performance and acknowledgement of his natural leadership abilities. The men of his squad looked to him for guidance and support, trusting his judgment in situations where the wrong decision could mean death for all of them. This trust was not given lightly by men who had learned that survival depended on the competence and courage of those around them. But even as Alvin celebrated the success at San Miguel and his own role in achieving it, he was aware that greater challenges lay ahead. The German army, though bloodied and retreating, was far from defeated. Intelligence reports indicated that they were falling back to prepared positions known as the Hindenburg Line, where they intended to make their final stand. Breaking through these defenses would require an effort that would dwarf even the massive Saint Mihiel operation. As September turned to October, the 82nd Division received orders that would take them to a sector of the Western Front where the fighting would be more brutal and the stakes higher than anything they had yet experienced. They were bound for the Argonne Forest, where Alvin York would face the supreme test of his courage, faith, and skill. A test that would transform him from an effective soldier into an American legend. The journey to the Argonne began on October 1st, 1918, as the division moved north through the devastated landscape of northeastern France. The men were battle-tested now, no longer the eager but inexperienced soldiers who had landed at Le Havre just months earlier. They had seen combat, had learned its brutal lessons, and had proved to themselves and their enemies that they could fight with the best soldiers in the world. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for what awaited them in the dark, tangled forests of the Argonne, where the German army had spent 4 years preparing defenses that many believed to be impregnable. It was here, among the shell-torn trees and muddy ravines of this ancient woodland, that the shy mountain boy from Tennessee would perform deeds that would echo through the pages of military history. As the men of Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, settled into their positions for what would prove to be the final and most brutal phase of their war, Corporal Alvin York checked his rifle one more time and offered a quiet prayer for the courage and wisdom to do his duty. He had no way of knowing that within a few days his name would be known throughout the world, or that the skills learned in the peaceful mountains of his childhood would be tested in a way that would define American heroism for generations to come. Chapter 7. The Forest of Shadows. The Argonne Forest in October 1918 was a place where nature and human warfare had combined to create a landscape of nightmarish beauty. Ancient oak and beech trees, some of which had stood for centuries, rose like cathedral pillars from a floor carpeted with autumn leaves. But 4 years of artillery bombardment had transformed this natural sanctuary into a killing ground where death lurked behind every tree and in every shadow. The forest stretched for miles along the western bank of the Meuse River, its dense canopy providing natural concealment for the German forces who had spent years fortifying every hill, ravine, and clearing. Machine gun nests were hidden among the fallen logs, connected by communication trenches that allowed defenders to move unseen from position to position. Artillery observation posts, built high in the strongest trees that had survived the bombardment, gave German gunners perfect views of the approaches that attacking forces would have to use. For the men of the 82nd Division, moving into positions for what would become known as the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the forest represented the ultimate test of everything they had learned about warfare. Unlike the relatively open terrain around Saint-Mihiel, where artillery and massed infantry attacks could be decisive, the Argonne would require small unit actions, where individual courage and skill would matter more than grand strategy. Corporal Alvin York and the men of Company G took their positions in the southern edge of the forest on October 6, 1918. The company had been reduced from its original strength by casualties suffered at Saint-Mihiel and during the movement north, but the survivors were seasoned veterans who understood both the capabilities and limitations of their weapons and equipment. The men of York's squad were a diverse group that reflected the makeup of the 82nd Division as a whole. There was Private Murray Savage, a quick-witted young man from New York whose humor helped maintain morale during the darkest moments. Private Mario Musillo, an Italian immigrant whose family had fled poverty in southern Italy, brought the kind of determination that comes from knowing what it means to fight for a better life. Private Michael Sassina, another immigrant soldier, had learned English in the army and spoke with fierce pride about his adopted country. These men, and the others who made up York's squad, had learned to work together with the kind of seamless cooperation that develops between soldiers who have faced death together. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, could communicate with gestures and glances that were invisible to outsiders, and had developed the mutual trust that was essential for survival in combat. The plan for the Meuse-Argonne offensive was ambitious in scope and brutal in its simplicity. Over 1 million American soldiers, supported by French forces, would attack along a front stretching for more than 20 miles. The objective was to break through the Hindenburg Line, the elaborate system of fortifications that represented Germany's last hope for avoiding total defeat. If successful, the offensive would drive German forces back across their own borders and potentially end the war before winter set in. But the German commanders understood the stakes as well as their American counterparts. They had concentrated some of their best remaining troops in the Argonne, including elite units that had been transferred from other sectors specifically to defend this crucial position. These were not the demoralized conscripts that the Americans had faced at Saint-Mihiel, but hardened veterans who knew that defeat here might mean the end of their homeland's resistance. The preliminary bombardment began on September 26th and continued for 3 days as Allied artillery sought to destroy German positions and cut the barbed wire that protected them. The sound was unlike anything the soldiers had experienced, even at Saint-Mihiel. Thousands of guns fired continuously, creating a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The sky glowed red with muzzle flashes, and the air filled with the acrid smoke of cordite and high explosives. For Alvin, crouched in a hastily dug position at the forest edge, the bombardment was both awesome and terrifying. The scale of destruction being unleashed was beyond anything in human experience, a demonstration of industrial warfare's power to reshape the very landscape. Trees that had stood for generations were splintered like matchsticks, while the earth itself was churned into a moonscape of overlapping shell craters. Yet even as he watched this display of devastating firepower, Alvin's hunter's instincts told him that the German positions were far from destroyed. The forest was too dense, the defensive positions too well concealed for artillery alone to eliminate the threat they represented. When the barrage lifted and the infantry attack began, they would be walking into carefully prepared killing zones where every approach had been mapped and every field of fire calculated. The attack began at dawn on September 29th, with the men of the 82nd Division advancing through the morning mist that clung to the forest floor. The going was treacherous from the first step, as soldiers had to navigate around shell craters and through tangles of fallen trees, while watching for snipers and machine gun positions that had survived the bombardment. Alvin's company was assigned to advance along a narrow valley that wound through the heart of the German defensive zone. Intelligence reports suggested that this route would allow them to bypass some of the strongest enemy positions, but the reality proved far more complex. The Germans had established interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach, forcing the Americans to fight for every yard of ground. The advance became a series of small battles, each one requiring courage, skill, and no small amount of luck to survive. German machine gunners, hidden in carefully camouflaged positions, would open fire without warning, forcing the Americans to take cover behind whatever protection they could find. Snipers, perched high in the surviving trees, picked off any soldier who exposed himself for more than a few seconds. But perhaps most challenging of all were the German artillery spotters, who could call down devastating barrages on any American position that seemed to be gaining ground. The shells would arrive with terrifying suddenness, exploding among the trees with a force that sent deadly splinters flying in all directions. Men who survived the initial explosion often fell victim to the razor-sharp fragments of wood and metal that filled the air after each detonation. Through it all, Alvin performed with the steady competence that had marked him as a natural soldier since his arrival in France. He led his squad forward by example, exposing himself to enemy fire when necessary, but never taking unnecessary risks that might jeopardize his men. His marksmanship skills proved invaluable in the close quarters fighting that characterized combat in the forest, where the ability to place accurate shots at short range often meant the difference between life and death. But as the days passed, and the American advance ground slowly forward through increasingly fierce resistance, it became clear that the German defenders were conducting a fighting withdrawal designed to exact maximum casualties from their attackers. They would hold a position just long enough to inflict serious damage, then fall back to the next prepared line of defense. Each victory was purchased with blood, and each mile of advance cost more than the previous one. By October 7th, Company G had been reduced to barely half its original strength. The survivors were exhausted, low on ammunition, and facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as the battle progressed. The men who had started the offensive with high hopes for a quick breakthrough now understood that they were engaged in a battle of attrition that might continue for weeks or even months. It was against this backdrop of mounting casualties and fading hopes that the events of October 8th, 1918, would unfold. The mission that would make Alvin York famous began as a routine patrol assignment, the kind of dangerous but necessary task that was assigned daily to small units throughout the American forces. No one could have predicted that this particular mission would result in one of the most extraordinary individual feats of arms in military history. The night of October 7th was cold and misty, with a fine rain that soaked through clothing and made every surface slippery and treacherous. Alvin spent the dark hours checking his equipment and studying the maps that showed the next day's objectives. Company G had been ordered to advance against a series of German positions that controlled a crucial rail line known as the Decauville Railroad. This narrow-gauge track had been built by the Germans to supply their forward positions, and its capture would seriously hamper their ability to maintain their defense of the Argonne. The mission was assigned to a patrol of 17 men under the command of Sergeant Bernard Early, an experienced non-commissioned officer who had led similar operations throughout the campaign. Alvin, as a corporal, would serve as second in command, responsible for keeping the patrol together and maintaining contact with company headquarters. The other members of the patrol represented a cross-section of American society, united by their shared commitment to the mission despite their diverse backgrounds. There were farm boys from Georgia and Tennessee who understood the value of teamwork and persistence. There were city men from New York and Boston who brought different skills but equal determination. There were immigrants from half a dozen European countries who saw in America's cause their own hopes for freedom and opportunity. As dawn broke on October 8th, the patrol moved out from their forward positions toward the German lines. The morning was overcast and gloomy, with thick mist clinging to the forest floor and reducing visibility to just a few yards. The conditions favored stealth over speed, allowing the Americans to move closer to their objectives than might have been possible on a clear day. The plan was simple in concept, but challenging in execution. The patrol would infiltrate German lines from the south, locate and destroy the machine gun positions that were preventing a larger American advance, and then return to friendly lines with intelligence about enemy dispositions. It was the kind of mission that required courage, skill, and coordination, but it was also the kind of operation that could go wrong in countless ways. For the first several hours, everything proceeded according to plan. The patrol moved through the forest with the stealth that had been drilled into them during months of training, avoiding German sentries and observation posts while steadily advancing toward their objectives. Alvin's hunting skills, developed in the mountains of Tennessee, proved invaluable in navigating the difficult terrain and spotting potential threats before they became deadly. But as they penetrated deeper into German-held territory, the patrol began to encounter signs that their presence had been detected. German patrols seemed to be moving with greater urgency, and the sound of voices and equipment could be heard from positions that intelligence reports had suggested were lightly held. It became increasingly clear that they were walking into a situation far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The crisis came suddenly and without warning. As the patrol crested a small ridge that would give them their first clear view of the German positions around the Decauville Railroad, they found themselves looking down into a valley where several dozen German soldiers were eating breakfast around a series of campfires. The Americans had stumbled into what appeared to be a major enemy encampment, far larger and more heavily defended than anything their intelligence had suggested. For a moment, both sides stared at each other in mutual surprise. Then training took over, and the morning air exploded with gunfire as German soldiers grabbed their weapons and began shooting at the Americans silhouetted against the ridgeline. The patrol, caught completely in the open with no cover, suffered immediate casualties as accurate German fire found its targets. Sergeant Early, the patrol leader, was among the first to fall, struck down by a burst of machine gun fire that ended his life before he could give any orders to his men. Several other soldiers fell in the initial exchange, their bodies tumbling down the slope toward the German position. The survivors, suddenly leaderless and under intense fire, found themselves in a situation that seemed hopeless. It was at this moment of crisis that Alvin York stepped forward to assume command of what remained of the patrol. The quiet mountain man who had once struggled with his conscience about military service was about to demonstrate that courage and faith could triumph over overwhelming odds. The boy who had learned to shoot turkeys in the Tennessee hills was about to face the supreme test of his marksmanship skills against human targets who were shooting back with deadly intent. The battle that would make Sergeant York a legend was about to begin, and its outcome would depend not just on military training or superior firepower, but on the character of a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest service to God and country required the warrior's skills as well as the believer's faith. Chapter 8. The Valley of Death. The German bullets whined overhead as Corporal Alvin York pressed himself against the rocky ground of the ridge, his mind racing to assess the desperate situation confronting what remained of his patrol. Below them, in the shallow valley that had seemed so peaceful moments before, dozens of German soldiers were taking up firing positions behind trees, rocks, and hastily constructed earthworks. The element of surprise was completely lost, and the Americans found themselves trapped in the open with nowhere to run. The first moments of the firefight had been devastating for the American patrol. Sergeant Early lay motionless where he had fallen, his life ended by the same burst of machine gun fire that had wounded 2 other members of the patrol. Private Carl Swanson, a young farmer from Minnesota, had been hit in the leg and was crying out for help from a position 20 yards down the slope. Private Joseph Konotski, an immigrant from Poland whose family had fled to America seeking freedom, had taken a bullet through the shoulder but was still trying to return fire with his rifle, but it was the machine guns that posed the greatest threat to the surviving Americans. York could count at least 4 separate weapons firing from concealed positions among the trees, their overlapping fields of fire designed to prevent any movement across the valley floor. The German gunners had clearly been well trained in the lethal art of interlocking fires, and they had positioned their weapons with the skill of men who understood exactly how to trap and destroy an attacking force. As the ranking non-commissioned officer still capable of action, York knew that the survival of his men depended on his ability to take immediate and decisive action. There was no time for elaborate planning or careful consideration of alternatives. The German fire was so intense and accurate that remaining in their current position would mean certain death for all of them within minutes. The terrain offered few options for maneuver. The ridge where they had been caught extended for several hundred yards in both directions, but German observers would spot any movement along its crest. The valley floor was completely dominated by the machine gun positions, making any attempt to advance or retreat across it suicidal. The only possibility lay in somehow getting close enough to the German positions to engage them at short range, where individual marksmanship might overcome the advantage of superior numbers and firepower. York's decision was characteristic of the man he had become since his spiritual transformation on the Tennessee mountain. Rather than attempting to retreat or calling for reinforcement that might never come, he chose to take the most dangerous course of action, a lone assault against the German positions that were decimating his patrol. It was a decision that could have been motivated by desperation, but those who knew York understood that it came from something deeper, a combination of faith, duty, and the hunter's instinct that had been shaped by years of solitary tracking in the Cumberland Mountains. "Keep them busy," he called to the surviving members of his patrol, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise of battle. "I'm going around to the left." Without waiting for acknowledgement, he began moving down the reverse slope of the ridge, using the terrain to mask his movement from German observers, who were focused on the main body of Americans. The descent was treacherous, made more difficult by the need to move quickly while avoiding loose rocks that might betray his position. York's experience as a hunter served him well, as he had learned long ago how to move silently through difficult terrain while pursuing wary game. But this was different from tracking deer or wild turkeys in the peaceful forests of home. Here, a single misstep or moment of carelessness would result not in a missed shot, but in instant death. As he worked his way around the German flank, York could hear the continuing firefight above him. His remaining men were keeping up a steady rate of fire, forcing the Germans to maintain their focus on the ridgeline rather than searching for threats from other directions. The sound of their rifles, mixed with the deeper chatter of German machine guns, created a symphony of violence that echoed through the forest. But even as he moved to attack, York was acutely aware of the moral dimensions of what he was about to do. The transformation from pacifist to warrior had been complete, but it had not eliminated his fundamental respect for human life. Each German soldier he might be forced to kill was someone's son, someone's husband, or father, a human being created in God's image who had been caught up in circumstances beyond his control. Yet York also understood that hesitation or moral squeamishness would doom his own men to certain death. The Germans had chosen their course when they opened fire on the American patrol, and they would continue killing until they were stopped by superior force. The responsibility of command required him to act decisively, regardless of his personal feelings about the necessity of taking human life. The approach to the German position took nearly 15 minutes, as York carefully worked his way through the forest undergrowth while avoiding sentries and observation posts. The sound of gunfire provided cover for any small noises he might make, but it also masked the approach of German soldiers who might be moving to outflank his own position. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. Every rustle of leaves might indicate the presence of a sniper. When York finally reached a position where he could observe the main German encampment, he was amazed by what he saw. The valley contained not just the machine gun positions that had trapped his patrol, but what appeared to be a major headquarters complex with dozens of soldiers, piles of supplies, and communication equipment that suggested this was a critical node in the German defensive network. His small patrol had stumbled into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated, but the size of the German force also created an opportunity. The enemy soldiers were spread out across a relatively large area, with many of them focused on the firefight taking place on the ridge. If York could position himself correctly, he might be able to engage targets throughout the encampment before they could organize an effective response to his attack. York selected a position at the edge of a small clearing that offered clear fields of fire in multiple directions while providing some cover behind a fallen log. From here, he could see the German machine gun positions that were firing at his men, as well as the command post where officers were coordinating the defense. The range was perfect for the kind of precision shooting that had made him famous in the mountains of Tennessee. Taking a deep breath and offering a silent prayer for steadiness and accuracy, York raised his rifle and began to engage the German soldiers with the methodical precision of a master marksman. His first shot, aimed at a machine gunner who had been firing continuously at the American position, struck its target cleanly, dropping the German soldier and silencing one of the weapons that had been pinning down the patrol. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Germans, who had been confident in their superior position and numbers, suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. Soldiers who had been focused on the ridgeline began turning to face this new threat. But York's shooting was so accurate and rapid that he seemed to hit every target he aimed at. Years of hunting in the Tennessee mountains had taught York to shoot with the kind of instinctive accuracy that comes from constant practice. He didn't need to consciously aim his rifle. The weapon had become an extension of his will, pointing automatically wherever his eyes focused. His shooting was not the wild, rapid fire of a desperate man, but the controlled, precise fire of a marksman who understood exactly what he was trying to accomplish. The German soldiers, trained to deal with massed infantry attacks supported by artillery, found themselves completely unprepared for this kind of individual marksmanship. Men began falling with horrifying regularity as York's bullets found their targets with mechanical precision. The machine gun positions, previously so confident in their ability to dominate the battlefield, suddenly found themselves exposed and vulnerable to attack from an enemy they couldn't locate. But the Germans were experienced soldiers, and they began to adapt to this new threat with a skill that had made their army one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. Small groups of soldiers began moving to outflank York's position, while others provided covering fire to mask their approach. The advantage of surprise was beginning to fade, and York realized that he would soon be facing a coordinated counterattack from multiple directions. It was at this critical moment that the battle took on an almost supernatural quality. As German soldiers rushed his position in a desperate attempt to overwhelm him through sheer numbers, York seemed to transcend the normal limitations of human reaction time and accuracy. His rifle spoke with deadly precision, dropping attackers before they could close to effective range. When his ammunition ran low, he smoothly transitioned to his pistol, continuing to fire with the same devastating accuracy. The scene that unfolded in that small clearing would be remembered and retold for generations to come. A single American soldier fighting alone against overwhelming odds was systematically destroying a German force that outnumbered him by more than 10-1. His shooting was so accurate and his movements so deliberate that it seemed almost mechanically perfect. as if he were conducting a carefully rehearsed demonstration rather than fighting for his life. But for York himself, the experience was intensely personal and spiritual as he fired and moved, reloaded, and fired again. He felt the presence of the divine guidance that had shaped every important moment of his life. The same faith that had led him from dissolute youth to Christian conversion, from pacifist conviction to military service, now sustained him in the supreme test of his courage and skill. The German resistance began to crumble as their casualties mounted, and their leaders fell to York's accurate fire. Officers who tried to rally their men became priority targets, while machine gunners who attempted to turn their weapons on this new threat found themselves exposed to return fire that was far more accurate than anything they could deliver. The confident defensive position was rapidly becoming a killing ground, where German soldiers were falling faster than they could be replaced. As the firefight continued, a profound silence began to settle over parts of the German position. Not the silence of peace, but the terrible quiet that comes when soldiers realize that continued resistance means certain death. Men who had been fighting with desperate courage just minutes before began to understand that they were facing an opponent whose skills transcended normal human limitations. It was then that the most extraordinary moment of an already extraordinary battle occurred. A German officer, recognizing that further resistance would only result in the unnecessary deaths of his remaining men, made the decision that would end the battle and make Alvin York a legend. Standing up in full view of the American marksman, he blew his whistle and called out the command that every soldier understands regardless of language: surrender. The sudden cessation of gunfire was almost as shocking as its beginning had been. After what seemed like hours, but had actually been only minutes of intense combat, the forest fell silent, except for the moans of wounded men and the sound of German soldiers laying down their weapons. York, his rifle still ready, but no longer needed, looked out over a scene of devastation that he had created through his own skill and determination. The cost of the battle was written in the bodies scattered throughout the clearing. German soldiers lay where they had fallen, victims of marksmanship that had been learned in peaceful pursuit of game but perfected in the crucible of combat. York's accurate count would later show that he had killed at least 25 enemy soldiers in the space of just a few minutes, a feat of shooting that military historians would study and debate for decades to come. But even more remarkable than the number of enemy dead was the number of prisoners who now stood with their hands raised in surrender. As German soldiers emerged from their positions throughout the valley, York found himself facing more than 130 men who had chosen life over continued resistance. The quiet mountain man who had once refused to fight on religious grounds now found himself in command of more prisoners than many entire companies captured during major battles. The irony was not lost on York as he began the process of organizing his prisoners for the march back to American lines. The man who had struggled with his conscience about taking human life had just demonstrated that when fighting was necessary, he could be more effective than soldiers who had never questioned the morality of warfare. His faith had not made him weak. It had made him strong in ways that purely secular training never could have achieved. As the surviving members of his patrol came down from the ridge to join him, their faces showed the awe and disbelief of men who had witnessed something beyond normal human experience. They had seen their quiet corporal transform himself into an instrument of divine retribution, delivering justice with a precision that seemed to come from a higher power. The Alvin York they thought they knew had revealed depths of courage and skill that none of them had suspected. But for York himself, the most important aspect of the battle was not the enemy soldiers he had killed or the prisoners he had captured. It was the knowledge that when tested in the ultimate crucible of combat, his faith had sustained him and his skills had proved adequate to the task. The boy who had learned to shoot in the peaceful mountains of Tennessee had become a warrior whose deeds would inspire soldiers for generations to come. Chapter 9: The March to Glory. The silence that settled over the German encampment after the surrender was unlike anything Alvin York had experienced in all his months of warfare. It was not the peaceful quiet of his Tennessee mountains, nor was it the temporary lull that sometimes occurred between artillery barrages. This was the profound stillness that comes when men realize they have witnessed something that transcends the normal boundaries of human capability. Standing in the center of the clearing, where moments before he'd faced overwhelming odds alone, York found himself in command of a situation that would have challenged the most experienced officers. More than 130 German soldiers stood with their hands raised, their faces showing the complex mixture of relief, defeat, and bewilderment that comes with unexpected surrender. Some were barely more than boys, conscripts who had been drafted in Germany's desperate attempt to replace the casualties of 4 years of war. Others were seasoned veterans whose weathered faces spoke of battles fought across half of Europe. The German officer who had made the decision to surrender approached York with a formal bearing that remained ingrained despite the circumstances of defeat. First Lieutenant Paul Jürgen Vollmer commanded the 120th Reserve Infantry Regiment's 1st Battalion, and he had enough experience to recognize that further resistance would be both futile and wasteful of his men's lives. Speaking in heavily accented English, he formally surrendered his command to the American corporal who had single-handedly destroyed their defensive position. York accepted the surrender with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire military service. There was no gloating or celebration, no attempt to humiliate men who had fought bravely before being overwhelmed by superior skill. Instead, he simply nodded his acknowledgement and began the practical business of organizing more than 100 prisoners for the dangerous journey back to American lines. The task was complicated by several factors that would have challenged much larger units with more experienced leadership. The route back to friendly territory lay through several miles of forest that was still contested, with German patrols and observation posts that might attempt to rescue the prisoners or eliminate them rather than allow their capture to be completed. The prisoners themselves, while apparently willing to surrender, represented a potential security threat if they decided to overwhelm their captors during the march. Most challenging of all was the fact that York's effective force consisted of only 7 men. The patrol that had started the day with 17 soldiers had been reduced by death and wounds to fewer than half its original strength. The survivors, while experienced and reliable, were exhausted by the morning's fighting and low on ammunition. The odds against successfully escorting so many prisoners through hostile territory seemed almost as overwhelming as those York had faced during the battle itself, but the same qualities that had enabled York to triumph in single combat now served him well in organizing the march to safety. His natural leadership abilities, enhanced by months of military training and combat experience, allowed him to establish clear procedures for managing the prisoners while maintaining security against potential threats. His understanding of human nature, developed through years of dealing with mountain folk who were proud and independent, helped him treat the German soldiers with the respect that ensured their continued cooperation. The march began with York's careful inspection of each prisoner, ensuring that all weapons had been surrendered and that no one was concealing grenades or other implements that might be used in an escape attempt. He organized the Germans into a column of 4s, with his own men positioned at intervals where they could maintain observation and control. The wounded from both sides were given what medical attention was possible under field conditions, with German soldiers helping to carry their injured comrades. As the strange procession moved through the forest toward American lines, York remained constantly alert for signs of ambush or rescue attempts. His hunter's instincts, sharpened by months of combat, allowed him to read the forest for potential threats while maintaining control over his prisoners. The other members of his patrol, inspired by their corporal's example and amazed by what they had witnessed, performed their duties with a precision that belied their exhaustion. The journey through the contested forest took on an almost surreal quality, as word of the unusual situation began to spread among both American and German forces in the area. German observation posts that might normally have opened fire on American troops were apparently paralyzed by the sight of their own soldiers marching under guard. American units that encountered the procession could hardly believe that such a small force had captured so many prisoners in a single action. The psychological impact of York's achievement extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For German forces that had been told American soldiers were inexperienced and ineffective, the sight of more than 100 of their comrades being marched to captivity by fewer than 10 Americans was profoundly demoralizing. For American units that had struggled for days to advance against determined German resistance, the success of York's small patrol suggested that individual courage and skill could overcome even the most carefully prepared defenses. As the march continued, York found himself reflecting on the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought him to this moment. Less than 2 years earlier, he had been a pacifist who believed that violence was incompatible with Christian faith. Now he was leading more prisoners to captivity than most entire companies captured during major offensives. The transformation was so complete and so rapid that it might have seemed impossible if anyone other than York himself had experienced it. But the spiritual dimension of his experience remained as important to York as the military aspects. Throughout the battle and the subsequent march, he felt the presence of the divine guidance that had shaped every major decision of his adult life. The same faith that had led him from dissolution to conversion, from pacifism to military service, now sustained him in the aftermath of his greatest trial. He understood that his marksmanship skills and tactical instincts were gifts that carried responsibilities as well as capabilities. The approach to American lines presented its own challenges, as York had to ensure that nervous sentries understood the situation before they opened fire on what appeared to be a German attack. The password and countersign system that normally governed movement in combat zones had not been designed for situations where small American units were escorting large numbers of prisoners. Clear communication and careful coordination were essential to prevent the kind of tragic mistake that could turn victory into disaster. When the procession finally reached the forward positions of the 82nd Division, the reaction of American soldiers ranged from amazement to disbelief. Officers who had been struggling to advance against German resistance could hardly credit that fewer than 10 men had captured more prisoners than their entire regiments had taken in days of fighting. The sight of German officers and non-commissioned officers being escorted by a corporal from Tennessee challenged every assumption about military hierarchy and combat effectiveness. Major George Edward Buxton, the battalion commander who had helped resolve York's spiritual crisis months earlier at Camp Gordon, was among the first officers to interview York about his extraordinary achievement. The same man who had used scripture to convince a reluctant pacifist that military service was compatible with Christian faith, now found himself trying to understand how that same soldier had performed feats that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. The initial debriefing was conducted in a dugout that served as battalion headquarters, with York providing a matter-of-fact account of the morning's events that understated rather than exaggerated his role in the action. His description of the battle was characterized by the same simple honesty that had marked all his previous military reports, with no attempt to claim credit for achievements that belonged to divine providence rather than human skill. But even York's modest account could not disguise the magnitude of what had occurred. The tactical situation he had faced, the odds he had overcome, and the results he had achieved placed his action in the category of military legends that are studied and retold for generations. The quiet mountain man, who had once struggled with his conscience about military service, had performed deeds that would be remembered as long as soldiers told stories of courage under fire. The news of York's achievement spread rapidly through the American Expeditionary Forces, carried by the communications network that connected frontline units with higher headquarters. General John J. Pershing himself, the commanding general of all American forces in France, took personal interest in the case when reports reached his headquarters. The idea that a single soldier had captured more than 100 prisoners in individual combat was so extraordinary that it required investigation to verify its accuracy. The investigation that followed was thorough and professional, with experienced officers interviewing not only York and the surviving members of his patrol, but also the German prisoners who had witnessed the action. The testimony was consistent and compelling, confirming that York had indeed accomplished what initial reports suggested. The German officers, speaking through interpreters, expressed professional admiration for the marksmanship and tactical skill that had made their defeat inevitable. Lieutenant Vollmer, the German commander who had made the decision to surrender, provided perhaps the most telling testimony about York's performance. An experienced officer who had fought in major battles across the Western Front, Vollmer stated that he had never encountered individuals shooting of such accuracy and consistency. His decision to surrender had been based not on cowardice or lack of determination, but on the professional judgment that continued resistance would result in the death of all his men without achieving any tactical objective. The formal recognition of York's achievement began with his immediate promotion from corporal to sergeant, an advancement that reflected not only his performance in battle, but also his demonstrated leadership capabilities. The promotion was accompanied by recommendations for higher decorations that would eventually result in awards from multiple Allied nations, recognizing the international significance of his achievement. But for York himself, the most meaningful recognition came from his fellow soldiers, who understood better than anyone what he had accomplished. The men of Company G, veterans who had proven their own courage in multiple battles, looked at their quiet sergeant with a mixture of respect and awe that spoke more eloquently than any official citation. They had seen their comrade transform himself from effective soldier to military legend in the space of a single morning's fighting. The tactical impact of York's success extended far beyond the immediate capture of prisoners. The destruction of the German position that had been blocking American advance allowed the 82nd Division to resume its offensive operations with renewed effectiveness. The Decauville Railroad, the objective that had seemed so difficult to achieve, was captured within hours as German resistance in the sector collapsed following the loss of key defensive positions. More importantly, York's achievement provided a psychological boost to American forces throughout the Argonne sector at a time when the offensive was beginning to stall against determined German resistance. The knowledge that individual American soldiers could perform such extraordinary feats reinforced confidence in the eventual success of the overall operation. If one man could capture more than 100 prisoners, then American forces as a whole could surely overcome whatever obstacles the Germans placed in their path. The impact on German morale was equally significant, though in the opposite direction. The rapid spread of stories about the American marksman who had single-handedly destroyed an entire defensive position contributed to the growing sense among German forces that continued resistance was futile. The psychological warfare value of York's achievement was as important as its tactical implications, helping to convince enemy soldiers that American fighting capability had been seriously underestimated. As October 8, 1918, drew to a close, Sergeant Alvin York found himself transformed from an unknown corporal into one of the most celebrated soldiers in the American Expeditionary Forces. The boy from the Tennessee mountains, who had once struggled with his conscience about military service, had become a living embodiment of American courage and skill. His name would soon be known throughout the world, inspiring countless others to acts of service and sacrifice. But even as recognition and fame began to surround him, York remained essentially unchanged by his extraordinary experience. The same faith that had sustained him through spiritual crisis and guided him through combat continued to shape his understanding of what had occurred. He viewed his achievement not as a personal triumph, but as evidence of divine providence working through human instruments to achieve righteous purposes. The legend of Sergeant York had been born in the forests of the Argonne, but its influence would extend far beyond the battlefields of the Great War. The quiet mountain man who had learned to reconcile faith with duty would become a symbol of American values that would inspire generations of soldiers and civilians alike. His story would be told and retold, studied and celebrated, as long as people remembered the importance of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Chapter 10. The Hero's Return. The armistice that ended the Great War on November 11, 1918, found Sergeant Alvin York still serving on the front lines with the 82nd Division. Though his extraordinary feat had made him famous throughout the American Expeditionary Forces, he had refused opportunities to be transferred to safer positions behind the lines. His sense of duty to his fellow soldiers kept him in the trenches until the guns finally fell silent at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month. The end of the war brought a strange mixture of celebration and melancholy to men who had lived with death as a constant companion for months or years. The sudden silence, after so many months of constant artillery fire and machine gun chatter, was almost more unsettling than the noise of battle had been. Soldiers who had learned to sleep through bombardments found themselves unable to rest in the unnatural quiet that settled over the Western Front. For York, the armistice represented both relief and reflection. The killing was over, and he could return to the peaceful life that his faith and temperament preferred. But the experiences of the past year had changed him in ways that would take time to fully understand. The mountain boy who had left Tennessee as a reluctant conscript was returning as a man who had seen the worst and best of human nature under conditions of extreme stress. The process of demobilization was slow and bureaucratic, with millions of soldiers waiting for transportation back to their home countries. York spent the winter of 1918-19 in France, participating in the routine duties of an occupation army while waiting for his turn to board a ship bound for America. The time gave him opportunity to process the experiences of the past months and to prepare mentally for the civilian life that awaited him. During this period, York began to receive indications of the fame that his October 8th action had generated in the United States. Letters from home mentioned newspaper articles and magazine stories that had made him a household name across America. Politicians and business leaders were expressing interest in meeting the hero from Tennessee, while movie producers and publishers were making offers for the rights to tell his story. The attention was both flattering and uncomfortable for a man who had always preferred the quiet life of his mountain community. York had performed his duty as he understood it, without thought of personal gain or public recognition. The idea that his actions had made him a celebrity was alien to everything he valued about authentic living and genuine service. The formal recognition of York's achievement culminated in April 1919, when he was awarded the Medal of Honor by General John J. Pershing in a ceremony that brought together representatives from all the Allied nations. The citation read in part, "After his platoon had suffered heavy casualties and 3 other non-commissioned officers had become casualties, CPL York assumed command. Fearlessly leading 7 men, he charged with great daring a machine gun nest, which was pouring deadly and incessant fire upon his platoon. His extraordinary heroism and self-sacrifice resulted in the capture of 132 German soldiers and the silencing of 35 machine guns. Standing at attention as General Pershing pinned the nation's highest military decoration to his chest, York felt the weight of responsibility that came with such recognition. The medal represented not just his own actions, but the sacrifice of all the men who had served and died in the great conflict. He understood that he was accepting the honor not just for himself, but as a representative of all American soldiers who had answered their country's call. The ceremony was attended by correspondents from newspapers and magazines across America and Europe, ensuring that York's story would reach an even wider audience. But perhaps more meaningful to York than the formal recognition was the respect shown by his fellow soldiers, men who understood better than anyone what he had accomplished under fire. Their quiet approval meant more to him than all the medals and citations that official ceremonies could provide. The journey home to America began in May 1919, when York finally boarded a troopship for the voyage across the Atlantic. The contrast with his outbound journey could hardly have been greater. Where the USS President Grant had carried nervous young men heading toward an uncertain fate, the ship that bore York homeward was filled with veterans whose experiences had transformed them into seasoned soldiers ready to return to civilian life. York spent much of the voyage writing in his diary and composing letters to his family and friends in Tennessee. The entries from this period reveal a man struggling to reconcile his wartime experiences with his fundamental values and beliefs. He had killed enemy soldiers in combat, something that would have been unthinkable to the pacifist he had been just 2 years earlier. Yet he felt no guilt or regret about actions that had been necessary to protect his own men and advance his country's cause. The ship docked in New York Harbor on May 22, 1919, to a reception that overwhelmed the modest mountain man from Tennessee. The Tennessee Society, a group of Tennesseans living in New York City, had organized celebrations that included parades, banquets, and meetings with prominent politicians and business leaders. York found himself the center of attention in a way that made him profoundly uncomfortable. The 5 days he spent in New York provided his first taste of the fame that would follow him for the rest of his life. He stayed at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, attended formal banquets where he was introduced to audiences of hundreds, and met with officials who wanted to be associated with his celebrity. The contrast with his simple mountain upbringing could hardly have been greater, and York found himself longing for the peaceful hills of home. But even as he was overwhelmed by the attention, York recognized an opportunity to use his newfound fame for purposes more important than personal advancement. The experiences of the war had shown him the importance of education and economic development in preparing young people for an increasingly complex world. The isolation that had characterized his own upbringing, while preserving certain valuable traditions, had also limited opportunities for the children of the mountains. The trip to Washington, D.C. that followed the New York celebrations provided York with his first opportunity to discuss these concerns with national leaders. Though President Wilson was in Paris negotiating the peace treaty, York met with other government officials who were impressed both by his military record and by his thoughtful approach to the challenges facing rural America. These conversations planted the seeds of ideas that would dominate the rest of his life. The final leg of York's journey home brought him back to the Tennessee mountains that had shaped his character and values. The train that carried him from Washington to Nashville, and then by automobile to the small town of Jamestown, passed through landscape that looked exactly as it had when he left nearly 2 years earlier. But York himself had been transformed by experiences that few mountain men had ever undergone. The homecoming celebration in Tennessee was more to York's taste than the formal ceremonies he had endured in New York and Washington. His neighbors and fellow church members gathered to welcome him home with the kind of simple, heartfelt affection that had always characterized mountain communities. There were no elaborate speeches or formal protocols, just the genuine warmth of people who had known him all his life and were proud of what he had accomplished. Mary Elizabeth York, his mother, waited for him on the porch of the family cabin with tears of joy streaming down her weathered face. The son who had left as a confused young man struggling with questions of faith and duty had returned as a mature soldier whose character had been tested in the ultimate crucible. She had prayed for his safety every day of his absence, and now those prayers had been answered in ways she could never have imagined. Gracie Williams, who had waited faithfully through all the months of uncertainty, welcomed York home with the quiet strength that had always characterized their relationship. Their wedding, which had been postponed by the war, was now scheduled for June 7, 1919, with Governor Albert Roberts himself performing the ceremony. The simple mountain girl who had fallen in love with a wild young man had waited for him to become the hero he was always meant to be. The wedding ceremony, conducted in the little church where York had experienced his religious conversion 4 years earlier, was attended by neighbors and friends who had known both bride and groom since childhood. There were no celebrities or politicians, no newspaper reporters or magazine photographers. It was simply a mountain wedding where two people who loved each other pledged to build a life together based on the values that had sustained their community for generations. But even as York attempted to return to the quiet life he had always preferred, the outside world continued to intrude with offers and opportunities that reflected his newfound fame. Publishers wanted to buy the rights to his life story. Movie producers offered huge sums for permission to dramatize his experiences, and businesses sought to use his name and image in advertising campaigns. The total value of these offers ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune by the standards of rural Tennessee. York's response to these opportunities revealed the depth of character that had made him a hero in the first place. Rather than accepting deals that would have made him wealthy but compromised his values, he turned down virtually every offer that seemed designed primarily to profit from his military service. He understood that his experiences belonged not to him alone, but to all the men who had served and sacrificed in the Great Conflict. Instead, York chose to use his fame to advance causes that he believed would benefit his community and his country. His first priority was education, particularly for the children of rural areas who faced the same limitations that had affected his own development. The isolation that had preserved mountain culture had also restricted opportunities for young people to prepare for an increasingly modern world. In the early 1920s, York formed the Alvin York Foundation with the mission of increasing educational opportunities in his region of Tennessee. The board members he recruited reflected his understanding of the political and economic connections necessary to accomplish significant change. They included Cordell Hull, the area's congressman who would later become Secretary of State under Franklin Roosevelt, and Tennessee Governor Albert Roberts, who had performed York's wedding ceremony. The foundation's initial goal was the establishment of a non-sectarian institution that would provide vocational training to young people from the mountains. York envisioned a school that would combine practical job skills with traditional academic subjects, preparing students for success in either rural or urban environments. The concept reflected his understanding that education must be relevant to students' lives while opening doors to broader opportunities. Fundraising for the York Agricultural Institute, as the planned school came to be known, required York to overcome his natural reluctance to speak in public. He traveled throughout Tennessee and neighboring states, addressing audiences that ranged from small church congregations to large civic organizations. His speeches were simple and direct, focusing not on his military experiences, but on his vision for improving educational opportunities in rural areas. The response to York's educational mission was generally positive, but progress was slower than he had hoped. The economic recession that followed the war made fundraising difficult, while local politics complicated efforts to select a site and establish governance for the new institution. York found that peacetime challenges required different skills than those that had served him in combat, but he approached them with the same determination and persistence. The publicity surrounding York's educational efforts helped maintain his public profile, but it also attracted attention from those who sought to exploit his fame for less worthy purposes. Promoters and speculators approached him with schemes that promised quick profits but delivered little of lasting value. York's mountain upbringing had given him a healthy skepticism about such offers, and he generally avoided entanglements that might compromise his reputation or mission. The most persistent offers came from Hollywood, where producers recognized the dramatic potential of York's story. The idea of a movie about the Tennessee mountain man who had become a war hero appealed to audiences who were hungry for heroes in an increasingly complex world. But York consistently refused to authorize such projects, believing that his experiences were too sacred to be commercialized for entertainment purposes. This resistance to Hollywood would continue for more than 20 years, until circumstances arose that convinced York that a movie might actually serve his educational mission. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, he remained focused on building institutions that would outlast any temporary fame his military service might have generated. The establishment of the York Agricultural Institute in Jamestown, Tennessee, finally occurred in 1926, after years of fundraising and political maneuvering. The school that opened its doors that fall was smaller than York had originally envisioned, but it represented the fulfillment of his dream to provide educational opportunities for mountain children who might otherwise have been limited by their circumstances. York served on the school's board of directors for the rest of his life, maintaining a personal interest in its operations and the welfare of its students. He frequently visited classrooms, speaking with young people about the importance of education and hard work in achieving their goals. His presence reminded students that someone who shared their background had achieved great things through dedication and service to others. The success of the York Agricultural Institute validated York's belief that fame could be used for constructive purposes when guided by sincere commitment to the welfare of others. Rather than seeking personal enrichment from his celebrity, he had chosen to invest his reputation in causes that would benefit future generations. The school became his greatest source of pride, more meaningful to him than all the medals and honors he had received for his military service. But even as York focused on his educational mission, the world around him was changing in ways that would eventually call him back to public service. The rise of fascism in Europe during the 1930s created new threats to the democratic values for which he had fought in the Great War. Once again, the quiet mountain man would be forced to choose between personal preference and public duty. The approach of World War II would test York's character in different ways than the Great War had, challenging him to speak out on national issues when his natural inclination was to focus on local concerns. The hero, who had once struggled with his conscience about military service, would become an advocate for American involvement in the fight against tyranny, using his reputation to influence public opinion in support of causes he believed were righteous. As the 1930s drew to a close and war clouds gathered over Europe, Sergeant York found himself once again at the center of debates about America's role in world affairs. The mountain man, who had wanted only to return to the peaceful hills of Tennessee, discovered that his fame carried responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal preferences. The legend that had been born in the forests of the Argonne would be called upon once more to serve his country's needs. Chapter 11. The Second Call. The storm clouds that gathered over Europe in the late 1930s cast their shadows even into the remote mountains of Tennessee, where Alvin York was quietly raising his family and managing the Agricultural Institute that had become his life's work. By this time, he and Gracie had been blessed with 8 children, 7 sons and a daughter, most of them named after American historical figures, in keeping with York's deep patriotism and love of his country's heritage. Their home in Pall Mall had become something of a pilgrimage site for visitors from around the world who came to meet the famous sergeant and hear his thoughts on war, peace, and the responsibilities of citizenship. York received these guests with the same mountain hospitality that had characterized his upbringing, but he was increasingly troubled by the reports they brought of events unfolding in Europe and Asia. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany and the aggressive expansion of Nazi influence across Europe struck York as a direct challenge to the democratic values for which he had fought in the Great War. The reports of persecution, militarism, and territorial conquest that reached even the isolated mountains of Tennessee convinced him that the world was facing a threat that might be even greater than the one defeated in 1918. But York's response to this new crisis was complicated by his awareness of the strong isolationist sentiment that characterized much of rural America in the 1930s. Many of his neighbors and fellow veterans believed that America had been drawn into the Great War by foreign entanglements that had cost American lives without producing lasting benefits. They argued that the United States should focus on its own problems, rather than involving itself in another European conflict. This isolationist sentiment was particularly strong among the rural and mountain communities that had provided many of the soldiers for the Great War. These areas had suffered disproportionate casualties during the conflict, and many families remained bitter about sons and husbands who had died for causes that seemed distant and unclear. The idea of repeating such sacrifices for another foreign war was deeply unpopular among people who felt that their previous service had been inadequately recognized or rewarded. York understood these sentiments because he shared many of the experiences that produced them. He had seen firsthand the costs of warfare, had lost friends and comrades to enemy fire, and had returned home to find that the promise of a war to end all wars had proved illusory. The peaceful world that was supposed to emerge from Allied victory had instead given way to economic depression, social unrest, and new international tensions. But York also understood, perhaps better than most of his contemporaries, the difference between wars fought for conquest and wars fought for survival. His study of current events, enhanced by conversations with visitors from around the world, convinced him that Nazi Germany represented a form of evil that could not be appeased or contained through diplomatic means. The parallels with the German militarism he had fought in France were too obvious to ignore. The internal debate that York experienced during this period paralleled in some ways the spiritual crisis he had faced when first confronted with military service 20 years earlier. Once again, he found himself weighing competing moral obligations, trying to determine what his faith demanded of him in circumstances that seemed to admit no easy answers. Once again, he sought guidance through prayer, Bible study, and consultation with trusted advisors. The resolution of this debate came gradually, as York studied the evidence of Nazi aggression and came to understand that isolationism was not a viable option when facing an enemy committed to world domination. The same sense of duty that had eventually led him to embrace military service during the Great War now convinced him that America could not remain neutral in the face of fascist expansion. The question was not whether America would be involved in the coming conflict, but whether it would enter early enough to affect the outcome. York's public emergence as an advocate for American involvement in World War II began with speeches to local organizations and gradually expanded to national forums as his views became known. His support for military preparedness and aid to Britain carried special weight because of his established reputation as a war hero who understood the costs of conflict. When Sergeant York argued that America needed to prepare for war, people listened with an attention that few other voices could command. The most dramatic expression of York's views came in 1940, when he finally agreed to authorize a Hollywood movie about his life story. For more than 20 years, he had resisted such proposals, believing that his experiences were too sacred to be commercialized for entertainment. But the international crisis convinced him that a movie might serve the cause of preparedness by inspiring Americans to understand their responsibilities as citizens of a democracy threatened by totalitarian forces. The negotiations for the movie rights were complex and reflected York's determination to maintain control over how his story would be told. He insisted on script approval, demanded that the film emphasize the moral and spiritual dimensions of his experience, and required that a substantial portion of the proceeds be donated to charitable causes. The final agreement gave him unprecedented influence over the production, while ensuring that the movie would serve educational as well as entertainment purposes. The casting of Gary Cooper as York was inspired, bringing together one of Hollywood's most respected actors with one of America's most authentic heroes. Cooper's natural dignity and understated acting style perfectly captured the essence of the mountain man who had become a reluctant celebrity. The actor spent time with York in Tennessee, studying his mannerisms and speech patterns while absorbing the atmosphere of the community that had shaped his character. The production of Sergeant York became a major cultural event with widespread publicity that reminded Americans of their country's heroic tradition while subtly arguing for the necessity of military preparedness. The movie's release in July 1941, just months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, provided perfect timing for a story about an American who had overcome his reluctance to fight when fighting became necessary for the defense of democratic values. The film's success exceeded even the most optimistic predictions, becoming the highest-grossing movie of 1941 and earning Gary Cooper an Academy Award for Best Actor. More importantly, from York's perspective, the movie reached millions of Americans with a message about the relationship between personal faith, civic duty, and military service. The quiet mountain man who had once struggled with his conscience about warfare had become a symbol of American resolve in the face of international crisis. But York's contribution to the war effort extended far beyond his role in inspiring the movie that bore his name. As America moved closer to active involvement in World War II, he volunteered his services for whatever purposes the government might find useful. His age and health problems prevented him from returning to active combat duty, but his reputation and speaking ability made him valuable for morale building and recruitment efforts. When the United States finally entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, York threw himself into supporting the war effort with the same dedication he had shown in combat 25 years earlier. Despite being 54 years old and suffering from various health problems, he applied for active military service, hoping to contribute directly to the fight against fascism. Though his application was rejected for medical reasons, he was commissioned as a major in the Army Signal Corps and assigned to duties that would make use of his unique qualifications. York's wartime service during World War II was characterized by the same selfless dedication that had marked his performance during the Great War. He traveled extensively throughout the United States, visiting training camps, where he spoke to young soldiers about the importance of their mission and the values they were defending. His presence at these camps provided a tangible link between the current war and the previous conflict, helping new recruits understand that they were part of a continuing tradition of American service. The impact of York's speeches on military morale was remarkable, as testified by the officers who arranged his visits and the soldiers who heard him speak. General Matthew Ridgway later recalled that York created in the minds of farm boys and clerks the conviction that an aggressive soldier, well-trained and well-armed, can fight his way out of any situation. His ability to inspire confidence and determination in young men facing the uncertainties of combat reflected his own authentic experience and genuine concern for their welfare. York also participated in bond drives and other civilian efforts to support the war, using his celebrity to encourage Americans to make the financial sacrifices necessary to sustain military operations around the world. His appearances at these events drew large crowds of people who wanted to see the famous war hero and hear his thoughts about current events. York used these opportunities not to glorify warfare, but to explain why the fight against fascism was necessary for the preservation of democratic civilization. The personal cost of York's wartime service was considerable, as his health problems were aggravated by the demanding travel schedule and the emotional stress of constantly reliving his combat experiences. He suffered from recurring respiratory problems that may have been related to gas exposure during the Great War, and the weight gain that had begun during the peaceful years of the 1920s and 30s was accelerated by the irregular eating and sleeping patterns that accompanied his speaking tours. But York's commitment to the war effort never wavered, even as his physical condition deteriorated. He understood that his reputation carried responsibilities that extended beyond personal comfort or convenience. The mountain man who had once wanted only to live quietly in his beloved hills had become a national resource whose presence could inspire others to greater efforts in defense of the country they all loved. The end of World War II in 1945 brought York a sense of satisfaction that America had once again triumphed over forces that threatened democratic values. The victory had required enormous sacrifices from millions of Americans, but it had vindicated his belief that the United States could not remain isolated from world affairs when fundamental principles were at stake. The country that had emerged from the conflict was stronger and more confident than the one that had entered it. But York's own emergence from the war years was marked by declining health and growing financial difficulties that would shadow the remaining years of his life. The demanding schedule of speaking engagements and public appearances had taken a toll on his physical condition, while poor financial management and generous giving to charitable causes had depleted the resources that might have provided security for his family. The contrast between York's public fame and private struggles became increasingly apparent during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Though he remained one of America's most celebrated war heroes, his personal circumstances reflected the broader challenges facing veterans who had sacrificed their own advancement to serve their country's needs. The man who had given so much to his nation found himself in need of assistance that was not always forthcoming from the society he had served so faithfully. York's health problems became increasingly serious during this period, beginning with a stroke in 1948 that left him partially disabled. Additional strokes followed, along with other complications that gradually reduced his mobility and independence. The mountain man, who had once moved through the forests of the Argonne with deadly grace, was increasingly confined to his home in Pall Mall, dependent on others for assistance with basic daily activities. The financial difficulties that accompanied York's declining health were particularly painful for a man who had always prided himself on self-reliance and independence. Medical expenses consumed much of the family's resources, while York's inability to work effectively reduced their income at the very time when their needs were greatest. The hero who had refused to profit from his fame during the height of his celebrity now found himself struggling to meet basic expenses. But even in these difficult circumstances, York maintained the dignity and faith that had characterized his entire life. He continued to receive visitors who came to pay their respects to the famous sergeant, treating each guest with the courtesy and warmth that had always marked his interactions with others. His conversations reflected not bitterness about his circumstances, but gratitude for the opportunities he had been given to serve his country and his community. York's final years were marked by the same quiet courage that had enabled him to face enemy fire in the forests of France and to overcome the challenges of building educational institutions in rural Tennessee. Though his body was failing, his spirit remained strong, sustained by the faith that had guided him through every crisis of his remarkable life. The boy who had learned to shoot in the peaceful mountains of Tennessee had become a man whose character had been tested in every conceivable way and had never been found wanting. Chapter 12. The Final March. The 1950s brought a series of challenges to Alvin York that tested his character in ways different from, but no less demanding than, the trials he had faced in combat. Age, illness, and financial difficulties combined to create circumstances that would have broken the spirit of many men, but York faced them with the same quiet determination that had carried him through every previous crisis of his remarkable life. The stroke that struck him in 1948 was the beginning of a long decline that would eventually leave him bedridden and dependent on others for the most basic care. For a man who had spent his entire life priding himself on self-reliance and physical capability, the loss of independence was perhaps more difficult to bear than physical pain. The hands that had once held a rifle with deadly precision now trembled with palsy, and the legs that had carried him through the forests of 2 continents could no longer support his weight. But even as his body failed, York's mind remained clear and his spirit unbroken. He continued to receive visitors in his bedroom, which had been converted into a makeshift reception area where he could meet with the steady stream of people who came to pay their respects to the aging hero. Politicians, veterans, historians, and ordinary citizens made pilgrimages to the small house in Pall Mall, drawn by the desire to meet the man whose story had inspired them throughout their lives. These visits provided York with some of his greatest pleasure during his final years, as he genuinely enjoyed meeting new people and sharing his perspectives on life, faith, and service. His conversations revealed a man who had thought deeply about his experiences and had drawn from them lessons that extended far beyond military tactics or battlefield heroics. He spoke often about the importance of faith in sustaining people through difficult circumstances, the value of education in opening opportunities for young people, and the responsibility of citizens to serve their communities and country. Gracie York, his devoted wife, became his primary caregiver during these difficult years, managing his medical needs while also handling the practical affairs of the household. The woman who had waited faithfully for him during the Great War now demonstrated the same loyalty and strength as she cared for him through his final illness. Their marriage, which had begun with such promise and had weathered so many storms, remained a source of mutual support and affection, even under the most challenging circumstances. The financial pressures that accompanied York's declining health created additional stress for the family, as medical expenses consumed resources that had never been abundant. Despite his fame and the success of the movie about his life, York had never accumulated significant wealth, having devoted most of his earnings to charitable causes and the support of educational institutions. The generosity that had characterized his approach to fame now left his family struggling to meet basic expenses. The response to York's financial difficulties revealed both the best and worst aspects of American society's treatment of its heroes. Many individuals and organizations stepped forward to provide assistance, recognizing that the man who had given so much to his country deserved support in his time of need. Veterans organizations, civic groups, and ordinary citizens contributed to funds that helped defray medical expenses and ensure that the York family could maintain their home in Pall Mall. But the fact that such assistance was necessary also highlighted the broader failure of American society to adequately provide for veterans who had sacrificed their health and opportunities in service to their country. York's situation was not unique. Thousands of veterans from both world wars faced similar challenges as they aged and their health declined. The hero's individual story reflected systemic problems that would take decades to address through improved veterans' benefits and healthcare programs. York himself never complained publicly about his circumstances or expressed bitterness about the contrast between his fame and his financial struggles. His mountain upbringing had taught him to accept hardship as a natural part of life, while his faith provided the spiritual resources necessary to maintain hope and dignity under difficult circumstances. He understood that his reputation and legacy were more valuable than any material wealth he might have accumulated. The recognition that continued to come to York during his final years provided some compensation for his personal struggles and reminded the American people of the debt they owed to the generation that had fought in 2 world wars. Awards and honors from various organizations acknowledged not just his military service, but his lifelong commitment to education and community service. Schools, buildings, and monuments were named in his honor, ensuring that his legacy would outlast his physical presence. One of the most meaningful forms of recognition came from the young people who had benefited from the educational institutions York had helped establish. Letters from graduates of the York Agricultural Institute, many of whom had gone on to successful careers in various fields, provided tangible evidence that his peacetime efforts had achieved lasting results. These letters meant more to York than all the medals and citations he had received for his military service, because they represented the continuation of his mission to help mountain children overcome the limitations of their circumstances. The approach of the 50th anniversary of York's famous action in the Argonne Forest generated renewed public interest in his story and brought him once again to national attention. Television programs, newspaper articles, and magazine features revisited the events of October 8, 1918, introducing his heroism to a new generation of Americans who had not lived through the era of the World Wars. These retrospectives emphasized not just the dramatic aspects of his battlefield achievement, but the character traits that had made such heroism possible. York's participation in these anniversary observances was limited by his physical condition, but he welcomed the opportunity to remind Americans of the values and principles that had motivated his generation's service. In interviews conducted from his bedside, he spoke about the importance of faith, duty, and sacrifice in maintaining the freedoms that Americans sometimes took for granted. His words carried special weight because they came from a man whose entire life had demonstrated his commitment to these ideals. The final stroke that would claim York's life came on September 2nd, 1964, as he lay in the Veterans Hospital in Nashville, surrounded by family members who had maintained their vigil throughout his long illness. The end came peacefully, without the drama that had marked so many other episodes of his remarkable life. The mountain man, who had faced death so often in combat, finally succumbed to the more ordinary enemy of old age and declining health. The funeral arrangements reflected both York's personal preferences and his status as a national hero. He was buried in the Wolf River Cemetery in Pall Mall, the small mountain community where he had been born and where he had chosen to spend most of his life. The service itself was conducted according to the simple traditions of his church, with hymns that had comforted generations of mountain folk and prayers that emphasized hope rather than despair. But the funeral also attracted attention from around the world, as representatives of the military, government officials, and ordinary citizens came to pay their final respects to the man whose life had embodied so many American virtues. The contrast between the simple mountain setting and the distinguished gathering of mourners reflected the paradox of York's life, a man who had remained rooted in his humble origins while achieving fame that transcended all social and geographical boundaries. The military honors accorded to York at his funeral acknowledged both his specific achievements and his symbolic importance to the American military tradition. The flag-draped casket, the honor guard, and the rifle salute were traditional expressions of respect for a fallen soldier, but they carried special meaning when rendered for a man whose individual courage had inspired countless others to similar acts of service. The final playing of taps, as the casket was lowered into the Tennessee soil, marked the end of a life that had bridged the gap between America's rural past and its modern future. In the years following York's death, his legacy continued to influence American culture and values in ways that he could never have imagined during his lifetime. Schools taught his story as an example of how individual courage could make a difference in critical moments. Military academies studied his tactics as demonstrations of how training, skill, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Churches pointed to his life as evidence of how faith could guide believers through the most challenging circumstances. The York Agricultural Institute, which had been his greatest peacetime achievement, continued to serve the educational needs of rural Tennessee, adapting its programs to meet changing economic and social conditions while maintaining its founders' commitment to providing opportunities for disadvantaged young people. The success of the institution validated York's belief that fame and influence should be used to benefit others rather than to seek personal advancement. The numerous biographies, documentaries, and historical studies of York's life ensured that his story would be preserved for future generations, but they also revealed the complexity of separating the man from the legend. The real Alvin York had been neither the perfect hero of popular imagination nor the simple mountain man of stereotype, but rather a complex individual whose character had been shaped by the interaction of faith, experience, and circumstance. Understanding his true significance required recognition of both his extraordinary achievements and his ordinary humanity. The ongoing debates about York's legacy reflected broader questions about the nature of heroism in American society and the relationship between individual achievement and collective values. Some critics argued that excessive focus on York's military exploits obscured the more important lessons of his peacetime service to education and community development. Others contended that his battlefield heroism remained the most significant aspect of his contribution to American history, demonstrating how individual courage could influence the outcome of great events. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of York's legacy was his demonstration that heroism was not limited to extraordinary circumstances or special individuals, but could emerge from ordinary people who were willing to put duty before personal preference when their communities or country needed them. The mountain boy who had struggled with his conscience about military service had shown that anyone could rise to greatness when guided by strong moral principles and sustained by genuine faith. The memorial dedicated to York on the grounds of the Tennessee State Capitol in 1968 provided a lasting reminder of his contributions to his state and nation. The bronze statue depicted him not in the dramatic pose of combat, but in the quiet dignity that had characterized his approach to both war and peace. The inscription emphasized his service to education and community development, as well as his military achievements, reflecting a more complete understanding of what made his life significant. As America faced new challenges in the decades following York's death, his example continued to provide inspiration for those who sought to serve their communities and country with honor and integrity. The specific circumstances of his heroism might never be repeated, but the character traits that made such heroism possible, faith, courage, duty, and humility, remained as relevant as ever to citizens facing their own test of character. The quiet mountain cemetery where York's body rests has become a place of pilgrimage for visitors who want to pay their respects to the man whose life embodied so many American ideals. The simple headstone, engraved with his name, rank, and dates of service, provides no hint of the extraordinary deeds that made him famous. But that modesty would have pleased the man who always insisted that he was simply doing his duty as he understood it. Alvin York died as he had lived, with dignity and faith intact despite the challenges that life had presented. The boy who had been born in poverty in the mountains of Tennessee had become a man whose name would be remembered as long as Americans honored courage, service, and sacrifice. His story remained a testament to the possibility that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when guided by strong moral principles and sustained by unshakable faith. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Sergeant York was not what he accomplished on a single day in the forests of France, but how he lived every day of his life according to principles that never wavered, regardless of circumstances. He had been tested by poverty and prosperity, by war and peace, by fame and obscurity, and had emerged from each trial with his essential character intact. That consistency of purpose and principle, more than any specific achievement, was what made him a true American hero whose legacy would endure for generations to come. Epilogue. The legend lives on. Today, more than a century after that misty October morning in the Argonne Forest, the story of Sergeant Alvin York continues to resonate with Americans and people around the world who seek inspiration in times of challenge and uncertainty. His transformation from reluctant pacifist to decorated war hero remains one of the most compelling narratives in American military history, demonstrating how individual conscience and national duty can be reconciled when guided by genuine faith and moral conviction. The physical reminders of York's legacy are scattered across the American landscape, from the state park that preserves his farm in Pall Mall, Tennessee, to the bridge that bears his name spanning the Tennessee River. The school he founded continues to educate young people, adapting its mission to meet contemporary needs, while honoring its founder's vision of providing opportunities for rural students. Military installations, government buildings, and civic centers named in his honor ensure that his contribution to American history will not be forgotten. But perhaps more important than these physical monuments are the intangible ways in which York's example continues to influence American culture and values. His story is still taught in schools as an example of how moral courage can guide individuals through complex ethical decisions. Military academies continue to study his tactics and leadership under fire, while religious communities point to his life as evidence of how faith can sustain believers through the most demanding circumstances. The debates that have surrounded York's story over the decades reflect broader questions about the nature of heroism and the relationship between individual achievement and collective memory. Some historians have questioned details of the official account, suggesting that the fog of war and the passage of time may have embellished certain aspects of his achievement. Others have argued that focusing too much on his military exploits obscures the equally important contributions he made to education and community development during his civilian years. These scholarly discussions, while valuable for understanding the complexities of historical memory, do not diminish the essential truth of York's legacy. Whether he killed exactly 25 enemy soldiers or somewhat fewer, whether he captured precisely 132 prisoners or a slightly different number, the fundamental facts remain undisputed. A small patrol of American soldiers, led by a corporal from the Tennessee mountains, achieved one of the most remarkable individual feats of arms in military history through a combination of courage, skill, and determination that inspired their contemporaries and continues to inspire succeeding generations. The broader significance of York's story lies not in the precise details of his battlefield achievement, but in what his life represented about the American character during a critical period in the nation's development. He embodied the transition from a rural, agricultural society to an urban, industrial one, while maintaining the values and principles that had sustained earlier generations through their own trials. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances without compromising his essential beliefs provided a model for how individuals could navigate the complexities of modern life while remaining true to their fundamental convictions. York's struggle to reconcile his pacifist beliefs with his duty to his country reflected a broader American ambivalence about the role of military force in international affairs. His eventual decision to embrace military service while maintaining his Christian faith and moral principles demonstrated that it was possible to be both a person of peace and a warrior when circumstances demanded it. This synthesis of seemingly contradictory values resonated with a nation that saw itself as peaceful, but was increasingly called upon to defend democratic ideals against totalitarian threats. The educational institutions that York helped establish in rural Tennessee represented his understanding that military victory alone was not sufficient to secure the blessings of freedom and democracy. The same energy and dedication that he had brought to combat, he later applied to the equally important task of preparing young people for the challenges and opportunities of citizenship in a rapidly changing world. His recognition that education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty and isolation reflected a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual opportunity and national strength. The financial struggles that marked York's later years highlighted the gap between American society's celebration of military heroes and its practical support for veterans facing the ordinary challenges of aging and illness. His situation was not unique among his generation of veterans, many of whom found that the gratitude of a grateful nation did not extend to adequate provision for their long-term needs. The efforts to assist York during his final years reflected both the personal affection that many Americans felt for him and the growing recognition that society owed more to its veterans than symbolic honors and periodic expressions of appreciation. The continuing interest in York's story, as evidenced by books, documentaries, and educational programs that appear regularly decades after his death, suggests that his example speaks to enduring concerns about the relationship between individual responsibility and collective welfare. In an era when many Americans feel disconnected from their communities and uncertain about their role in national affairs, York's life provides a reminder that individual actions can make a significant difference when guided by strong moral principles and sustained by genuine commitment to the welfare of others. The global reach of York's fame, extending far beyond the American borders where his story originated, reflects the universal appeal of narratives about ordinary people who rise to extraordinary challenges. His transformation from a poor mountain youth to an internationally celebrated hero demonstrates that greatness is not limited to those born with special advantages or opportunities. The skills he learned while hunting for food to feed his family proved equally valuable when hunting enemy soldiers in the forests of France, suggesting that the qualities that matter most in times of crisis are often developed through the ordinary experiences of daily life. The religious dimension of York's story continues to resonate with believers who struggle to reconcile their faith with the demands of living in a world marked by conflict and injustice. His example suggests that spiritual conviction need not lead to withdrawal from worldly responsibilities, but can instead provide the foundation for more effective engagement with the challenges of citizenship and service. His ability to maintain his Christian beliefs while serving as an effective soldier offered a model for how people of faith could participate fully in the defense of democratic values, without compromising their essential spiritual commitments. The technical aspects of York's marksmanship achievement continue to fascinate military historians and firearms enthusiasts who study the tactics and equipment that made such accuracy possible under combat conditions. His use of traditional hunting techniques in military combat demonstrated how skills developed for peaceful purposes could be adapted to meet the demands of warfare. The precision and consistency of his shooting under extreme stress reflected not just natural talent, but years of disciplined practice that had developed his abilities to their maximum potential. The leadership qualities that York displayed during his famous action and throughout his military service provided examples that are still studied in military academies and leadership development programs. His ability to assume command of a desperate situation and inspire his men to continue fighting despite overwhelming odds reflected the kind of character-based leadership that transcends rank and formal authority. His decisions under fire demonstrated the importance of individual initiative and moral courage in achieving objectives that might seem impossible through conventional approaches. The cultural impact of York's story, as reflected in the Hollywood movie that introduced his exploits to millions of Americans, demonstrated the power of heroic narratives to shape public understanding of national values and purposes. The timing of the film's release, just months before America's entry into World War II, provided a perfect example of how individual stories could serve broader political and social purposes. The movie's success reflected not just entertainment value, but the public's hunger for examples of American heroism that could inspire confidence in the nation's ability to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. The international recognition that York received from Allied nations during and after World War I reflected the global significance of American participation in the conflict and the symbolic importance of individual American achievements in demonstrating the character and capabilities of the nation as a whole. His decorations from France, Italy, and other countries represented not just personal honors, but acknowledgement of America's contribution to the defense of democratic civilization. The respect shown by foreign leaders and military commanders validated the effectiveness of American training and the quality of American soldiers. The scholarly attention that York's story has received from historians, biographers, and military analysts has produced a substantial literature that examines his achievements from multiple perspectives and places them in broader historical context. These studies have generally confirmed the essential accuracy of the original accounts, while providing additional details about the circumstances that made his success possible. The continuing academic interest in his story reflects its value as a case study in individual heroism, military tactics, and the relationship between personal character and professional performance. The preservation efforts that have maintained York's farm, protected his personal papers, and documented his story for future generations reflect a recognition that his legacy extends beyond the immediate circumstances of his military service to encompass broader questions about American identity and values. The decision to designate his home as a state historic site acknowledged that places associated with significant individuals can serve important educational and inspirational purposes for visitors seeking to understand the sources of American strength and character. The ongoing relevance of York's example to contemporary military personnel facing the challenges of modern warfare demonstrates the timeless nature of the qualities that made him effective as a soldier and leader. His emphasis on marksmanship, tactical awareness, and personal initiative remains as important today as it was during World War I, while his ability to maintain moral clarity in the midst of combat provides guidance for soldiers facing ethical dilemmas in complex operational environments. His story continues to be told in military training programs as an example of how individual excellence can influence the outcome of larger military operations. The educational programs that use York's story to teach about World War I, American history, and the development of democratic values have introduced his achievements to countless students who might otherwise have little knowledge of the sacrifices made by earlier generations in defense of freedom. These programs emphasize not just the dramatic aspects of his battlefield heroism, but the character traits and life experiences that made such heroism possible. They encourage students to consider how they might develop similar qualities of courage, determination, and service in their own lives. The memorial observances that mark the anniversary of York's famous action each October 8th provide opportunities for communities to reflect on the values and principles that he represented while considering their contemporary relevance. These ceremonies often include veterans from subsequent conflicts who draw inspiration from York's example while sharing their own experiences of service and sacrifice. The continuity between past and present that these events represent helps maintain public appreciation for the ongoing costs of freedom and the importance of individual commitment to collective welfare. The family legacy that York established through his children and grandchildren, many of whom have continued his tradition of military and public service, demonstrates how the influence of significant individuals can extend across generations. The values that he embodied and taught have been passed down through his descendants, who have carried his name and reputation into new careers and circumstances, while maintaining his commitment to faith, duty, and service. Their achievements reflect the enduring power of personal example to shape character and inspire achievement. The technological advances that have transformed warfare since York's time have not diminished the relevance of the human qualities that made him effective as a soldier. While the weapons and tactics of modern combat differ dramatically from those of World War I, the need for individual courage, tactical awareness, and moral clarity remains constant. His example continues to inspire military personnel who face new challenges with timeless requirements for character and competence under pressure. The literary and artistic works that have been inspired by York's story reflect its enduring power to capture the imagination and engage the emotions of creative artists seeking to explore themes of heroism, sacrifice, and moral conviction. These works, ranging from serious historical studies to popular fiction, have helped maintain public awareness of his achievements while interpreting their significance for new audiences and changing circumstances. They demonstrate how individual stories can serve as vehicles for examining broader questions about human nature and social responsibility. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Sergeant Alvin York, more than a century after his birth in the mountains of Tennessee, we are reminded that heroism is not limited to extraordinary circumstances or special individuals, but can emerge from ordinary people who are willing to put duty before personal preference when their communities or country need them. His story provides timeless lessons about the importance of character, the power of faith, and the possibility that individual actions can make a significant difference in shaping the course of history. The quiet cemetery in Pall Mall where York rests continues to receive visitors from around the world who come to pay their respects to a man whose life embodied so many of the qualities that Americans admire and aspire to emulate. The simple headstone that marks his grave provides no detailed account of his achievements, but the continuing stream of visitors demonstrates that his legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of people who understand that freedom requires the sacrifice and service of individuals willing to defend it. In our own time, as we face new challenges and uncertainties, the example of Alvin York reminds us that the qualities that matter most in times of crisis, courage, faith, duty, and humility, are available to anyone willing to cultivate them through the ordinary experiences of daily life. His transformation from reluctant pacifist to decorated war hero, and from unknown mountain man to national symbol, demonstrates that greatness is not determined by circumstances of birth or advantage, but by the choices we make when tested by adversity. The story of Sergeant York is ultimately a story about the potential that exists within every individual to rise above limitations and achieve something meaningful in service to others. It reminds us that heroism is not about seeking glory or recognition, but about doing what needs to be done when others depend on our courage and competence. It teaches us that the skills and values developed in peaceful pursuits can be called upon when circumstances demand extraordinary performance, and that faith can provide the foundation for achievement that transcends normal human limitations. As long as Americans value courage, honor the sacrifice of those who serve in our defense, and believe in the possibility that individual actions can make a difference in the world, the story of Alvin York will continue to inspire and instruct. His legacy reminds us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, but also that the burden of defending it can be borne by ordinary people who possess extraordinary character. In a world that often seems dominated by forces beyond individual control, his example provides hope that personal integrity and moral conviction can still influence the course of events and inspire others to similar acts of service and sacrifice. The reluctant hero who captured 132 Germans in the forests of the Argonne has become a permanent part of American memory, representing the best qualities of a nation that has always depended on the courage and character of its citizens to preserve the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity. His story will continue to be told as long as people understand that freedom requires defenders, and that the most effective defenders are often those who would prefer to live in peace, but are willing to fight when fighting becomes necessary for the protection of what they hold dear. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the remarkable life of Sergeant Alvin York, the reluctant hero who became one of America's greatest symbols of courage, faith, and service. His story reminds us that heroism is not about seeking glory, but about doing what's right when others depend on our strength and character. In a world that still faces challenges and uncertainties, the example of this quiet mountain man continues to inspire us to be worthy of the freedoms that others have defended at such great cost. If you enjoyed this exploration of Sergeant York's incredible story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to War Stories 4. Sleep for more tales of courage, sacrifice, and heroism from throughout military history. Until next time, rest well knowing that the spirit of service and dedication embodied by heroes like Alvin York continues to protect and inspire us all.